Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a medieval peasant's shoes, or more accurately, their worn leather boots wrapped in rags as winter locks the world in ice. And the question isn't what's for dinner, but will there be dinner at all? Picture yourself standing in your small timber cottage as November's first frost creeps across the thatched roof above you. Your breath clouds in the dim interior. Outside, the fields lie brown and empty, stripped bare by the harvest. The livestock huddle in their shelter, their ribs starting to show. And you're looking at the corner of your single room where sacks of grain slump against the wall, where clay pots sealed with wax sit in shadow, where strings of dried vegetables hang like strange ornaments from the beams. This modest collection of food must carry you, your family, and possibly your animals through 4 months of cold, so bitter that your ale freezes in its jug overnight. You probably won't survive this if you've miscalculated the harvest, or if illness strikes, or if the Lord demands more taxes than you can spare. But let's assume you've done everything right. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing this little community spread across the world, all of us settling in together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The storage situation is less pantry and more survival logistics centre. Most peasant homes don't have separate rooms. You're living, sleeping and storing food in one multi-purpose space. Your grain sacks lean in the driest corner, elevated on stones to keep them off the damp earth floor. Rye and barley dominate wheat as for the Lord's table, not yours. You've got oats too, which some of your neighbours feed primarily to horses, but which you'll absolutely eat when things get tight. These grains are your foundation, your caloric bedrock. The difference between functioning and collapsing. Hanging from the ceiling beams, you've got strings of onions, their papery skins rustling when you brush past. There are turnips, parsnips, and carrots, roots that handle cold storage remarkably well. You've learned through generations of trial and error that root vegetables can last months if you keep them cool and dark. Some families dig pits outside, lining them with straw, to create underground storage where the earth's own cold preserves food without freezing it solid. It's a delicate balance, too warm, and everything rots too cold and it turns to mush. In clay pots sealed with tallow or wax, you've stored your pulses, dried peas, beans, lentils. These are your protein sources through the dark months. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants fully understood nutrition in any modern sense, but they definitely knew that a winter diet of pure grain left people weak and sick. The pulses add something essential, we'd call it protein. They just knew it kept them standing upright. Then there's the salted and smoked provisions. If you managed to slaughter a pig in autumn, and not every family could afford to, you've got some meat. Preserved in salt hanging in your chimney corner, where the constant low smoke from the hearth works its preserving magic. The smell of it, that deep, smoky, salty aroma, is one of the few pleasant things about your winter quarters. Salt itself is precious, sometimes worth more than the meat it preserves. You use it sparingly, making every crystal count. There's a small collection of dried herbs, thyme, sage, whatever you manage to gather in summer. These aren't luxuries, they're medicine and flavour, both making the monotonous winter diet slightly more bearable, while also treating various ailments. A handful of dried mushrooms hangs in a cloth bag, wrinkled and dark, waiting to add earthiness to a future stew. You've also got whatever dairy products you managed to preserve, hard cheeses that could survive a siege wrapped in cloth and aging in the coolest spot you can find. If you're lucky, there's a small clay pot of butter salted heavily to keep it from going rancid. These fats are crucial. Winter cold demands calories, and fat is calorie dense in a way that grains and vegetables simply aren't. Look around this storage situation with honest eyes. It seems like a lot when November begins, but you're doing mental mathematics that would exhaust a modern accountant. How many people are eating from these stores? Just you and your spouse, or are there children, elderly parents? Each mouth changes the equation drastically. How cold will this winter get? A mild winter means the stored food stretches further, because your body isn't burning every calorie just to maintain temperature. A brutal winter, the kind where frost patterns form on the inside walls of your home, means you'll consume everything faster. And here's the thing that keeps you awake some nights: there's no resupply coming. No medieval grocery store will restock in January. No trade caravan will arrive in February with fresh provisions. Whatever you're looking at right now in this dim November cottage is essentially it. You can supplement with some winter foraging if you're skilled and lucky, maybe trade with neighbours if they fared better, possibly receive charity from the local monastery if things get desperate. But fundamentally, you're looking at your lifeline, and it needs to last until the first spring greens emerge, which might be March if you're fortunate, April if you're not, or even May in a late spring. The weight of this responsibility is almost physical. You feel it in your chest as you count the grain sacks one more time, as you check the seals on the clay pots, as you examine the dried vegetables for any signs of mould or rot. One mistake, one miscalculation in the autumn slaughter, one unexpected tax burden, one longer winter than usual, and the mathematics of survival stop adding up. But you've prepared as well as you can. Your ancestors survived this. Their ancestors before them survived it. The knowledge of winter survival runs in your blood, taught by mothers to daughters, fathers to sons in a chain stretching back centuries. You know the tricks, the substitutions, the ways to make a little food stretch impossibly far. Outside, the wind picks up, whistling through gaps in the timber walls. You pull your woolen cloak tighter and move toward the hearth where a small fire glows. The storage room inspection is complete. Now comes the long work of rationing, of making these provisions last through the frozen months ahead. Winter is here. Your survival begins now. The autumn harvest dictates everything about your winter survival, and by late October you're racing against the first hard frost. Your body aches from weeks of relentless labour, bending, digging, cutting, hauling, but you can't stop because every root left in the ground after the freeze is a root you'll never eat. The fields have already given up their grain threshed and stored weeks ago, but now you're after the vegetables that hide beneath the soil, the ones that have been quietly growing all summer while you tended other crops. Turnips come up first. Their white and purple bulbs, surprisingly heavy in your cold-numbed hands. You've planted them densely because they're reliable, hardy, and willing to grow in soil that's already exhausted from growing grain. Each turnip gets a quick inspection. Any with soft spots or damage go into the eat immediately pile, because they won't last in storage. The good ones, firm and unblemished, get their greens twisted off. You'll eat those tonight, wilted in the pot with the last of the autumn cabbage, and then into baskets they go. Turnips will be a major player in your winter diet, showing up in pottage roasted by the fire, or eaten raw when you're too tired to cook. Parsnips are sweeter, almost a treat comparatively. They're actually better after a frost. Something about the cold converts their starches to sugars, making them less bitter. You dig carefully around each one because they grow deep, and snapping them off halfway down means losing half the food. There's a meditative quality to this work, your hands in the cold earth. The smell of soil and decaying leaves the sky grey and low above you. Every parsnip successfully excavated feels like a small victory against the coming hunger months. Carrots smaller and paler than the orange giants modern people know come next. Medieval carrots are white, yellow or purple, and honestly they're a bit woody and bitter, but they store well and add substance to meals. You're not complaining. Anything that lasts until February is worth its weight in silver. Some of your neighbours believe carrots help with vision in the dark winter months. Whether that's true or not, you eat them anyway because refusing food based on superstition is a luxury you can't afford. Onions and leeks have already been pulled and are drying in the sun during whatever brief warm afternoons autumn still offers. Onions are miraculous, they last for months if kept dry and cool, and they transform bland grain mush into something approaching actual food. You've strung them by their dried stems, creating those hanging chains that now decorate your cottage like the world's most practical garland. Every time you brush past them, they rustle and release that sharp onion scent that means civilization, means cooking, means you're still in control of your meals. The cabbage harvest happened earlier in September, but you've been processing it ever since. Some heads got eaten fresh, a luxury you allowed yourselves before winter locked in. Others are being transformed through fermentation, packed into crocks with salt, in a process that will preserve them for months, and create something sour and strange but absolutely edible when everything else runs out. Sauerkraut isn't just a German thing, fermented vegetables are a survival technology that stretches across medieval Europe wherever cabbage grows. The crocks sit in the coolest part of your dwelling, quietly bubbling away as beneficial bacteria do their preservation work. Beets are another root cellar champion, earthy and sweet, their greens already consumed weeks ago. They stain everything they touch, a deep purple red, which means your pottage will have some visual variety, at least even if the flavour remains relentlessly the same. You layer them in straw-lined pits, or pack them in sand-filled boxes, creating little hibernation chambers where they'll sleep through winter mostly intact. Then there's the grain situation, and this is where things get interesting. Your rye and barley were harvested in late summer, threshed on the communal threshing floor, and winnowed to separate grain from chaff. But you've also got oats, which occupy this weird social position in medieval food culture. Wealthy people scoff at oats as animal feed fit only for horses and desperately poor Scots. But you know better, oats are nutritious, they grow in poor soil, and they make a thick warming porridge that sticks to your ribs on frozen mornings. Snobbery is for people who've never been truly hungry. Some years, if you're particularly fortunate and the harvest was generous, you might have a small amount of wheat. This is usually owed to your lord as part of your rent and taxes, but occasionally there's a bit extra, and you hoard it like treasure. Wheat bread, real light. Wheat bread is an Easter luxury you dream about during the dark months. For now, though, it's carefully stored, precious beyond measure. Pulses are part of this final harvest push too. Dried peas and beans dangle in their pods from the cottage beams, hardening in the smoky air. When they're completely dry, you'll shell them, a task often done on dark November evenings, when outdoor work is impossible. The rhythmic sound of peas rattling into a bowl becomes part of the winter soundscape, accompanied by low conversation or folk songs sung to pass the time. Some families manage to grow lentils, though they're finicky about soil conditions. If you have them, you feel wealthy in a specific calorie-based way. Lentils cook faster than peas, or beans using less precious firewood, and they break down into a thick, satisfying mush that fills bellies efficiently. You've also foraged extensively in the autumn woods, hazelnuts gathered from under bare branches, their shells hard and promising. Walnuts if you're lucky enough to live near the right trees. These nuts are pure fat and protein compact nutrition that stores easily and provides crucial calories when winter's cold drains energy from your body at an alarming rate. You crack them sparingly, rationing them through the months ahead, sometimes adding crushed nut meats to special occasion porridges. Late apples hang in the orchard, the varieties specifically bred to last in storage. These aren't crisp, sweet-eating apples. They're hard, tart storage apples that will keep in a cool cellar for months, slowly withering but remaining edible. Some you'll dry into leathery rings strung up and preserve through desiccation. Others go into the root cellar hole where you'll check them weekly for rot because one spoiling apple can ruin dozens. Herbs have been harvested and dried all through autumn, not just cooking herbs but medicinal ones too. Bundles of dried nettles which you'll reconstitute in water for a spring-like green vegetable experience, midwinter yarrow for fevers, chamomile for sleepless nights when hunger gnaws too insistently. These hang from every available beam, creating a strange indoor garden of brittle plants that crackle when you brush against them. The autumn harvest isn't one dramatic day. It's weeks of increasingly frantic work as winter approaches. Every day the sun sets a bit earlier, every night the frost creeps a bit closer, and you race against the calendar with the desperation of someone who understands that failure means starvation. Your hands develop calluses on top of calluses. Your back screams. You sleep hard and dreamless, too exhausted for anything else. But when it's done, when the last root has been pulled and the last apple picked and the last herb bundle hung, there's this moment of grim satisfaction. You've done it. The fields are empty, the larder is full, and winter can come. You've given yourself and your family a fighting chance. That's all anyone can do. Now comes the part where you become part chemist, part gambler, and part magician, because fresh food wants to rot, and your job is to convince it otherwise for the next 4 months. Preservation isn't just a technique. It's the difference between February survival and February starvation, and every medieval peasant becomes an expert in the dark arts of keeping food edible, long past its natural lifespan. Salt is your first and most precious ally, but here's the catch, it's expensive. Like genuinely expensive a way that modern people struggle to comprehend. Salt might cost you several days' wages for a quantity that barely fills a large bowl. You've likely saved for months to buy enough for winter preservation, or you've traded grain or labour for it, or if you're coastal, you've spent back-breaking days evaporating seawater in shallow pans. Inland peasants sometimes travel for days to reach salt markets, carrying whatever they can trade. The Romans paid soldiers partially in salt, that's where the word salary comes from, and that economic reality hasn't changed much by medieval times. But salt performs miracles. When you pack it around meat, it draws out moisture through osmosis, creating an environment where the bacteria that cause rot simply can't survive. You're not thinking about bacteria, of course, that's centuries away from discovery, but you know from generations of observation that salt-preserved meat lasts, while unsalted meat becomes a putrid nightmare within days. So if you've slaughtered a pig in autumn, you're rubbing every piece of it with salt, packing it in layers of salt, creating what amounts to a hostile desert environment for decay. The preserved pork goes into a wooden barrel or large crock, each layer of meat separated by more salt pressed down firmly to eliminate air pockets. The whole thing gets sealed with a wooden lid weighted down with stones. Over the next weeks, the salt pulls liquid from the meat, creating a brine that further preserves everything. By midwinter, when you fish out a piece of this pork, it'll be almost unrecognizably hard and salty. You'll need to soak it in water for hours before cooking to make it remotely palatable. But it'll be preserved edible safe. That's what matters. Smoking is your other major preservation technique, and it requires less salt, which makes it attractive when you're counting every precious crystal. Your cottage's central hearth produces near-constant smoke that rises to the rafters and escapes through gaps in the thatch or through a smoke hole. You've hung fish strips of meat and even cheese up in this smoky zone, where the constant low heat and chemical compounds in the smoke do their preserving work. Oak and beech make the best smoking wood. Pine is too resinous and makes food taste like turpentine, which is saying something, given how your standards have adjusted to winter eating. The smoke does several things at once. It dries the food out, it deposits antimicrobial compounds on the surface, and it creates a hostile environment for flies and other pests. A well-smoked fish becomes hard as leather, almost mummified, but scrape off the exterior, soak it in water, and you've got protein that'll keep you alive. Some of your neighbours have dedicated smokehouses, small structures with smouldering fires in pits below and racks above, but most peasants just use their regular hearth smoke, because building and maintaining a separate smokehouse is a luxury of time and resources. Fermentation is the technique that feels most like magic, where food seems to preserve itself through some mysterious process. You don't understand the science that helpful bacteria outcompete harmful bacteria, creating acids that preserve food, but you absolutely know it works. Your sauerkraut crock is the prime example. Cabbage, salt, thyme and pressure combine to create something that lasts for months, and as a bonus tastes interestingly sour rather than blandly bland. You've also got fermented dairy, if you're lucky, cheese being the ultimate example. Fresh milk spoils almost immediately, especially without refrigeration, but transformed through fermentation and aging, it becomes something that lasts months or even years. Hard cheeses are essentially concentrated preserved milk, all the water removed, salt added, aged until they're firm enough to survive winter storage. A wheel of aged cheese represents summer's abundance locked into a form that winter can't destroy. Historians still argue whether peasants commonly made their own cheese or mostly purchased it from more specialized producers, but either way, if you have cheese in your winter stores, you're significantly better off. Butter gets salted, too heavily salted, and packed into crocks or wrapped in cloth soaked in brine. By February it'll taste more like salty fat than what we'd recognize as butter, but it's calories, and it's preserved, and you'll stir it into your pottage without complaint. Drying is perhaps the oldest preservation technique, requiring nothing but time and air. You've strung apple slices on threads, hanging them near the hearth, where gentle warmth dehydrates them into leathery rings. Mushrooms collected in autumn, and you have to know your mushrooms or you'll be dead, so there's no casual foraging here. Hang in cloth bags, shriveled and concentrated. Herbs lose their water content and can be crumbled into winter stews. Even some fish can be simply air-dried in cold autumn weather, though this works better in coastal regions where cold, dry winds blow consistently. Plums, if you have access to them, become prunes through slow drying. These are treasured, sweet, portable, lasting, providing a burst of fruit flavour in the dead of winter, when you've forgotten what fresh fruit tastes like. Some wealthier peasants might have access to dried figs or raisins through trade, but that's getting into luxury territory. Root cellars and storage pits exploit the earth's own cold. You've dug a pit below the frost line, lined it with straw, and layered in your most fragile vegetables, the ones that can't handle true freezing but need cold storage. The earth maintains a steady temperature just above freezing, creating natural refrigeration. Your turnips, carrots, and beets nestle in this underground chamber, insulated from the worst winter cold, but kept cool enough to remain dormant. You check these pits weekly, pulling out anything that shows signs of rot before it spreads. Some vegetables you've simply left in the ground, covered with thick layers of straw or manure. Parsnips in particular can survive frozen in the soil and be dug up as needed through winter, assuming the ground doesn't freeze so hard that digging becomes impossible. It's risky, animals might find them. The freeze might be too severe. You might simply forget where you planted them under 2 feet of snow. But it's also a way to have fresh vegetables in January without using indoor storage space. Honey is your only reliable sweetener, and conveniently it's also naturally preservative due to its low water content and slight acidity. If you keep bees or can trade for honey, you use it not just for sweetness but as a preservation medium. Fruits can be packed in honey and will last indefinitely. The honey itself never spoils, literally never assuming you keep moisture out. Archaeologists have found honey in Egyptian tombs. That's still technically edible thousands of years later, though your medieval self doesn't know that. You just know that honey is precious lasting and makes winter eating slightly less grim. Vinegar preservation is less common among peasants, because making or buying vinegar requires resources, but some families manage it. Vegetables pickled in vinegar brine last well, and provide that sour, sharp flavour that cuts through the monotony of winter porridge. The acidity kills bacteria and prevents spoilage, though again you're not thinking in terms of bacteria, you just know it works. Every preservation technique carries risk. Salt can fail if you didn't use enough. Smoke can fail if the weather was too damp. Fermentation can go wrong, creating dangerous toxins instead of safe acids. Root cellars can flood or freeze. Dried foods can absorb moisture and mold. You check everything, constantly removing failures before they contaminate successes, making difficult decisions about whether something is still good or dangerously spoiled. These decisions can be literally life or death. The knowledge of preservation passes down through generations mother to daughter, primarily, though everyone participates. You learned by watching, by helping, by occasionally failing and facing the consequences. There are no written recipes for most peasants you can't read anyway, so everything exists as embodied knowledge, techniques refined over centuries, regional variations based on local conditions and available resources. Bread is the foundation of your existence, the thing that transforms grain into life itself, and the medieval phrase, breaking bread, isn't poetic, it's literal, because your winter loaves are so dense and hard that they require actual physical force to get into edible pieces. This isn't the fluffy soft bread of modern bakeries. This is survival bread, and it tastes like it. Your bread is overwhelmingly rye or barley, sometimes a mixture of both, occasionally with oats thrown in if the harvest was poor and you're stretching supplies. Wheat bread is a fantasy for Easter, a twice-yearly luxury if you're fortunate. Rye bread is dark, almost black, with a sour tang that comes partly from the grain itself, and partly from the natural fermentation happening in your starter. Every peasant household maintains a sourdough starter, a blob of fermented dough kept alive through regular feeding, passed down through generations, occasionally through centuries. Your starter might be descended from when your great-grandmother used a living link to ancestors who also survived winters on dark bread. The baking process begins the night before. You take a portion of your precious grain measured carefully, because this must last until spring, and grind it. If you're relatively prosperous, you might take your grain to the Lord's mill and pay the miller his fee, usually a portion of the flour itself. But many peasants can't afford this, so you're grinding at home using a hand-quern 2 circular stones that you rotate against each other with exhausting repetitive effort. Your shoulders burn, your hands cramp. The sound of stone on stone fills your cottage for hours. This is why bread feels earned. The resulting flour is coarse dark, flecked with bits of bran, and occasionally tiny stone particles that have worn off the quern. This stone dust will gradually wear down your teeth over a lifetime of eating. Archaeologists examining medieval peasant skeletons find teeth worn nearly flat by midlife, and bread grit is a major culprit. But worn teeth beat starvation, so you keep grinding. You mix the flour with water, sometimes with a bit of your small beer instead, which adds flavour and extra leavening, and a chunk of your sourdough starter. Salt goes in if you can spare it, but salt is precious, and bread can technically be made without it, just less palatably. The dough comes together stiff and heavy, nothing like the elastic, stretchy wheat dough that bakers prefer. Rye doesn't have much gluten, so your dough is dense and somewhat sticky, more like thick clay than anything else. Kneading is brief, overworking rye dough makes it gummy. Then you shape it into large round loaves and set them aside to rise. This is a slow process in winter because your cottage is cold, so the dough sits overnight slowly expanding as the wild yeasts in your starter do their work. By morning the loaves have grown slightly, though they'll never achieve the dramatic rise of wheat bread. They're dense, heavy rounds that you score with a knife in a cross pattern, partly to help them bake evenly, partly as a blessing because bread is sacred even when it tastes like edible cardboard. Now comes the challenge baking. Most peasant cottages don't have ovens. Ovens are expensive to build and maintain, they require significant fuel, and many lords actually prohibit private ovens as a way to force peasants to use the communal oven and pay the associated fees. So you've got options, none of them ideal. Option 1, you take your risen loaves to the communal village oven, usually owned by the lord or the church. You wait your turn, half the village has the same idea, and you pay your fee, usually a portion of the baked bread or a small coin. The baker or oven keeper manages the fire, and your loaves go into the retained heat after the fire has burned down. These ovens are massive stone or brick affairs that hold heat for hours. Your bread bakes slowly in falling temperature, emerging with a thick, hard crust and a dense interior. You mark your loaves with the distinctive pattern, so you can identify them when they come out, because 20 families worth of dark rye loaves all look suspiciously similar. Option 2, you bake at home using a covered pot or a clay cloche set directly in your hearth embers. This produces smaller loaves and requires careful fire management, but it's free and you can do it on your own schedule. The bread develops an even thicker crust, almost shell-like, but the interior stays relatively soft. Some families flip the loaves halfway through, creating an all-over crust that preserves the interior even longer. Option 3, used in desperate times or when you're truly isolated, you make flatbreads on a hot stone or griddle set over the fire. These cook quickly and require less fuel, but they don't keep as well. Oatcakes fall into this category, popular in Scotland and northern England. They're essentially unleavened oat flour, mixed with water, rolled thin and cooked on a griddle. They keep reasonably well if stored in a dry place and provide quick portable calories. Your finished bread, let's say you've used the communal oven and brought home your marked loaves, is hard as wood when it cools. The crust is thick enough to knock on. You store these loaves in a dry place, sometimes hanging them from the rafters in cloth bags to keep mice away. A single loaf might last your family 3 or 4 days, but not because you're eating small amounts, because the bread is that dense and filling. To actually eat this bread, you have techniques. Fresh bread still warm from the oven can be torn apart with effort and eaten with whatever's available, a bit of cheese, some onion, a scraping of salted butter if you're fortunate. But most of your winter bread eating involves stale bread, which is less stale and more fossilized. You break off chunks, sometimes requiring a hammer genuinely, and soak them in your pottage or stew. The bread absorbs liquid, softens, and provides bulk and calories to your meal. Sometimes you soak pieces in ale or milk. The bread functions almost like an edible bowl or spoon, soaking up flavors and nutrients. There's also trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used as plates, especially in wealthier households. You pile food on top of the bread, which absorbs juices and gravies, and then you eat the gravy-soaked trencher itself, or in truly wealthy households, give it to the poor as alms. But as a peasant, you're not wasting bread as a plate, you're eating every crumb because those crumbs represent hours of grinding, kneading, waiting, and precious grain from your limited stores. The taste is aggressively sour, earthy, sometimes slightly bitter. Modern people trying to recreate medieval peasant bread often find it nearly inedible, but your palate is different. This is what bread tastes like. This is what it's always tasted like. The sourness is normal. The density is expected. The way it sits heavy in your stomach is the point. This bread is fuel designed to keep you upright and working through a winter day. It's not supposed to be a delightful eating experience. It's supposed to prevent death. And here's something interesting, this bread is actually fairly nutritious. Whole grain rye contains vitamins, minerals and fibre that milled white flour lacks. The sourdough fermentation makes nutrients more bioavailable and partially breaks down anti-nutrients. You're not getting scurvy despite months without fresh produce, partly because your bread, crude as it is, provides more nutrition than you realise. Your ancestors didn't understand vitamins, but they understood that people who ate this bread survived winters, while people who didn't. Bread baking follows a rhythm through winter. You can't bake every day, the fuel cost is too high and the labour too intensive, so you bake in batches maybe once a week, producing several loaves that will see you through until the next baking day. The smell of baking bread in your cold cottage is intoxicating, a brief moment of warmth and abundance, even in the darkest part of winter. For those few hours you feel wealthy. The cauldron hanging over your hearth is never truly empty. It's a constantly evolving entity that bubbles, simmers and transforms throughout the winter, and understanding pottage is understanding medieval survival itself. This isn't a recipe you follow. It's a philosophy, a fluid strategy that adapts to whatever you have on any given day. Pottage is everything and nothing humble and essential, the dish that keeps you alive when nothing else will. At its most basic, pottage is a thick soup or thin stew made from whatever's available. You start with water, sometimes the same water you've been adding to for days, building flavour layers, and you add your base ingredient, which in winter is almost always some kind of pulse. Dried peas are the foundation of most peasant pottage. You've soaked them overnight to soften them, and now they simmer for hours, breaking down into a thick creamy mush that provides protein and bulk. The texture is somewhere between soup and porridge, thick enough to almost hold a spoon upright. Into this base you add whatever else exists. A handful of barley to thicken it further and add different texture. Chopped onions, if you can spare them, their sharpness mellowing into sweetness as they cook. A turnip diced into chunks that will soften over hours of simmering. Maybe some chopped cabbage or the last of your kale, wilted and dark green against the muddy colour of the peas. Herbs from your dried bundles, thyme, sage, whatever you have, get crumbled in to add some complexity beyond vaguely grain-flavoured mush. If it's been a particularly good week, maybe there's a bone in there something, with a bit of meat still clinging to it, or just a ham bone from your preserved pork, lending its salty, smoky essence to the liquid. The bone might stay in the pot for days, giving up its last flavours boiled so thoroughly that it becomes brittle and hollow. Some families crack these bones and scoop out the marrow, pure fat, pure calories, slippery and rich, in a way that nothing else in your winter diet approaches. The pot hangs on a hook or chain over the fire, and the fire itself is never really out during winter. You bank it at night, covering the coals with ash to slow the burn, and in the morning you blow it back to life and add more fuel. The pottage simmers in the retained heat, sometimes bubbling actively, sometimes just staying warm, the surface occasionally rippling. This near-constant cooking is essential because it keeps the food safe harmful. Bacteria can't survive sustained heat, and it also means that food is always ready when hunger strikes. Here's something modern people don't always grasp. You're not making 3 distinct meals per day. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner as separate eating events is not really your reality. Instead, you eat from the pottage pot when you're hungry and when work permits. You might have a bowl of it when you wake cold and stiff from your insufficient blankets. You might eat again midday if you're doing heavy work. Evening brings another bowl, maybe the heartiest of the day if you've added something special. But it's all the same pottage, just evolving as you add to it. And you do add to it constantly. As the pottage cooks down, you add more water. When you have a vegetable that's starting to look questionable in storage, into the pot it goes. Stale bread gets broken up and stirred in thickening the mixture and ensuring no food goes to waste. Some families have pottage that's technically been going for weeks, each day's additions building on the previous day's base, creating layers of flavour that become impossible to distinguish. It's the ultimate slow food, the original meal prep, the dish that makes scarcity stretch into adequacy. The flavour is earthy. That's the kind word for it. It tastes like survival, like dirt and smoke and whatever grew in your field. The peas provide a grainy, slightly bitter base. The onions add some sharpness if they're fresh, sweetness if they've been cooking a while. The herbs help, but they can't transform this into anything resembling modern cuisine. When you add a piece of salted pork or a bone, the saltiness permeates everything, and suddenly the whole pot tastes like a gift from God. That fat and salt cutting through the monotonous vegetable flavours like sunshine through clouds. Different regions have different names for essentially the same concept. In some areas it's called pottage, in others it's pottage brewies or just the pot. Wealthier peasants might distinguish between thick pottage with lots of solids and thin pottage that's more broth-like. But honestly, you're just trying to make calories happen. Naming conventions feel like a luxury. Seasonality affects your pottage even in winter. Early winter, when storage vegetables are still relatively fresh, your pottage might have distinct chunks of turnip, carrot, and onion. By midwinter, those vegetables are softer, starting to break down, and your pottage becomes more homogeneous. Everything melding into an indistinct mush. Late winter, when supplies run truly low, pottage might be mostly water thickened with whatever grain you can spare and flavoured with. Hope, mostly. Some days, if you're fortunate, you make white pottage with milk or cream instead of water as the base. This is significantly richer, coating your mouth with fat, making you feel satisfied in a way that water-based pottage never quite achieves. But milk is precious, it's more valuable as cheese or butter. So white pottage is a special occasion thing, maybe for a feast day, or when someone is ill and needs building up. There's also frumenti, which is a fancier cousin of pottage made with wheat berries boiled in milk or broth, sometimes sweetened with honey if you're genuinely wealthy. This is aspirational eating for most peasants, the kind of thing you might have once or twice a year when you're trying to impress someone or celebrate something significant. But your daily reality is the humble pea and turnip sludge simmering away in its perpetual state. The pot itself becomes almost sacred. It's one of your most valuable possessions, a large iron cauldron that might have been in your family for generations passed down, patched, cherished. You guard it carefully because replacing it would cost more than you earn in months. When you move it to add fuel to the fire or to serve out portions, you're cautious, aware that dropping it would be catastrophic in ways beyond just the immediate mess. Eating pottage is done with wooden bowls and spoons, or sometimes with the trencher bread we talked about earlier, soaking up the liquid with torn pieces of stale bread. You might share a bowl with your spouse or children, everyone dipping in with their own spoons or pieces of bread. Hygiene in the modern sense isn't really a concern, you're all exposed to the same germs anyway, living in close quarters, sharing beds, breathing the same smoky air. The amount you eat varies with availability and need. After a day of heavy outdoor work cutting wood hauling water from a frozen well, mucking out animal shelters, you need more calories, so you eat more pottage, maybe 2 full bowls. On days when you're mostly indoor huddled by the fire doing small tasks, you eat less. Children get priority on the thicker portions where chunks of vegetable or meat have accumulated. The elderly get the broth easier to digest, requiring less chewing for teeth that have worn down over decades of hard bread. Historians still argue about how monotonous medieval peasant diets actually were. Some evidence suggests more variety than we'd expect, with wild foods and opportunistic additions providing some diversity. Other evidence paints a picture of relentless sameness, the same pottage day after day, week after week. The truth probably varies by region, by specific year, and harvest by individual family resourcefulness. But one constant seems clear: pottage in some form was daily reality, the reliable foundation that everything else was built upon. And you know what? After a long cold day, when your fingers are numb and your body aches, a bowl of hot pottage, even if it tastes like mildly flavoured mud, is genuinely wonderful. The heat spreads through your body. The calories begin their work. You hold the wooden bowl between your palms, absorbing warmth through your skin, and for those few minutes winter doesn't feel quite so hostile. February is when optimism dies. You've been rationing since November, carefully measuring portions, convincing yourself the stores will last. But now the sacks slump nearly empty, and the root cellar echoes when you walk through it. This is the month that earned the old name the Hunger Moon, when winter has already taken most of what you had, and spring remains a cruel rumour whispered by people who've clearly lost their minds. Let's be honest about where you are right now. The grain sacks that were full and promising in November are now maybe a quarter full, and that's if you've been disciplined. The vegetables in storage have been steadily disappearing, some eaten, some rotted and discarded, some mysteriously vanished to mice despite your best efforts. Your strings of onions hang sparse and sad, many of them soft or sprouting. The salted pork is long gone or reduced to a few rock-hard pieces that are more salt than meat. Your cheese wheel has been whittled down to a shadow of its former self. You're now entering the phase where food stops being about meals and becomes pure mathematics. How many calories does each family member need to stay alive and functional? How many do you actually have? What's the absolute minimum someone can survive on, and for how long? These aren't abstract questions. They're life or death calculations you're making multiple times daily. The peas are running low, which is terrifying because peas have been your protein backbone. You start stretching them by adding more water to the pottage, making it thinner, more broth-like, less satisfying. Where you used to add a full cup of peas, you now add half a cup, and make up the volume with extra grain and water. The resulting pottage is weak, watery, barely substantial. It fills your stomach temporarily, but leaves you hungry again within hours. Barley and oats become your new best friends because they bulk up liquid better than anything else. You're making a lot of grain porridge now, just oats boiled in water, with maybe a pinch of salt if you're feeling extravagant. It's gluey bland, the kind of thing that sits in your stomach like a stone, but at least provides some calories. You eat it morning and evening, sometimes with a bit of honey stirred in if someone's genuinely suffering, but mostly just plain because there's no point wasting flavour on something that's purely functional. The root vegetables that remain are questionable. You're cutting away soft spots, trimming off mould using pieces that 3 months ago you'd have thrown to the pigs. That turnip with the wrinkly skin and the slight smell, into the pot it goes. The carrots that have gone rubbery, chopped up, boiled until soft, perfectly edible if you don't think too hard about it. You're not being careless, you know the difference between aging and dangerous. But your standards have adjusted significantly. You start foraging in ways that would have seemed desperate in November. Tree bark becomes a legitimate food source. Specifically, the inner bark of certain trees, pine, birch, willow, can be scraped away dried and ground into a flour that extends your grain supplies. It tastes like eating a forest woody and slightly bitter, but it's fibrous bulk that makes your diminishing grain stretch further. You're essentially making bread that's part rye, part tree. Some cultures did this traditionally during famines, and the knowledge has been passed down because famines unfortunately are regular visitors. Old peas that you'd normally discard, the ones that are shriveled, discoloured, maybe slightly bug-damaged, get picked through and used. You're boiling them for even longer to make them palatable, and yes, some are so hard they never fully soften, so you eat around them, or just crunch through and deal with it. Protein is protein, and you're not in a position to be picky. If there are animals in your household that you've been keeping alive through winter, a pig you've been feeding scraps to chickens that have stopped laying, you're now facing brutal decisions. Do you slaughter the pig now and have meat for the next few weeks, or keep it alive until spring in hopes it can breed and provide future food? Do you kill the chickens for one substantial meal, or continue feeding them your scarce grain? In hopes they'll start laying again when daylight increases, there are no right answers, only gambles with various odds of success. Wild foraging becomes more intensive despite the cold. You're checking frozen streams for fish, though most fish are sluggish and deep in winter, making them hard to catch. You're looking for winter-hardy plants, dock leaves if they survive dead nettle, which has some edible parts even in cold months, certain types of grass seeds if you can find them under the snow. You might set snares for rabbits or hares, though hunting regulations are strict and poaching can get you in serious trouble. Still, when it's maybe get caught versus definitely starve, you're willing to risk it. You're also eating things that aren't traditionally food in times of plenty. Acorns, if you collected any, can be processed to remove their bitter tannins through repeated boiling and soaking. The result is a starchy meal that can be made into a kind of bread or porridge. It's labour-intensive and the flavour is aggressively earthy, but it's calories, and it's free if you gathered them in autumn. Some families survive February almost entirely on acorn bread, supplemented with whatever else they can scrounge. Dried peas get ground into flour. Pea flour bread is a thing, and it's about as appetizing as it sounds, but it's denser and more protein-rich than pure grain bread. You mix it with whatever grain flour you have left, creating Frankenstein bread that's dark, heavy, and tastes vaguely of dirt and legumes, but it keeps you upright. The milk situation, if you have a cow or goat, is complicated. Animals that have been surviving on poor winter fodder produce less milk, and what they do produce is thin and weak. But every drop is precious now. You're making the thinnest possible soups with milk, stretching a cup of milk into a pot of liquid that can feed the family. Or you're carefully churning it into butter, then mixing that butter into everything to add calories and fat. Some families resort to hunger bread or famine bread recipes that use minimal grain and maximum filler. This might be made from a tiny amount of rye flour mixed with ground peas, ground bark, sawdust, yes, really in truly desperate times, and anything else that can be bound together and baked. It's barely bread, more like edible compressed fibre, but it gives your stomach something to process and tricks your body into feeling less desperately empty. You're also rationing differently now. Children, and whoever does the heaviest work, get the most food. The elderly and anyone who's weak or ill might actually get fed first, not out of sentimentality, but because they're most at risk of dying, and you need everyone to survive until spring. But there's also a darker calculation happening in some households. If someone is already weak, already sick, do you give them precious food that might be wasted if they die anyway? Or do you prioritize the strong who have better odds of making it through? These are horrifying decisions that people occasionally have to make, and they leave psychological scars that last generations. Your daily hunger is now constant. It's not the skipped lunch feeling modern people experience. It's a deep, gnawing ache that wakes you at night, that makes you irritable and foggy-headed, that causes your body to start consuming its own muscle for energy. You're thinner, everyone is thinner. Your clothes hang looser, your face is gaunt, children's ribs are visible. This is what February looks like for a medieval peasant when the stores run low. And yet somehow you keep going. You get up each morning, you tend the fire, you make your thin porridge, you ration what remains, you search for anything edible, you tell yourself spring is coming. Because the alternative is giving up, and giving up means death. So you endure, you calculate, you compromise, you eat things you'd never consider in other circumstances, and you survive. That's the only goal now, survive until the first green shoots appear. The animals you live with represent a calculation so complex it would break a modern spreadsheet, because every creature in your yard or shelter is simultaneously a source of food, a tool for survival, and a walking investment that took months or years to develop. Deciding when or if to slaughter anything is like trying to solve a puzzle where every answer is partly wrong. Let's start with the pig, assuming you have one. A pig is a miracle animal for peasants. It eats almost anything, converts kitchen scraps and forage into meat with impressive efficiency, and provides more usable products than almost any other livestock. A full-grown pig slaughtered in autumn yields enough meat to significantly improve your family's winter prospects. But here's the problem: that pig could also breed next spring, producing a litter of piglets that could themselves be raised and slaughtered, creating an ongoing food source rather than a one-time windfall. So as autumn approaches, you're weighing options with desperate intensity. Do you slaughter now and have guaranteed meat for winter, or keep the pig alive, spending precious resources feeding it through the cold months in hopes of future benefit? If you slaughter, you need to preserve every scrap perfectly, because there's no second chance. If you keep it alive and it dies of disease or cold, you've lost both the immediate meat and the future breeding potential. And if you keep it alive but can't feed it adequately, it'll be weak and sick by spring, possibly unable to breed anyway. Most peasants who decide to slaughter do it in late autumn, ideally after the first hard frost, when the cold acts as natural refrigeration and helps with preservation. The killing itself is brutal, quick and utilitarian. You're not squeamish about death when you've grown up with it as a regular part of survival. The pig is stunned, bled scalded to remove bristles, and butchered with practiced efficiency. Every single part gets used. Meat is salted or smoked, fat is rendered into lard for cooking and preservation. Blood is made into sausages or blood pudding. Intestines become sausage casings. Bones are boiled for broth or ground for meal. Skin becomes leather. Bristles become brush fibers. Nothing is wasted, because waste is a luxury you cannot afford. But many families don't have the option to slaughter because they don't have a pig to begin with. Pigs cost money or resources to acquire, they need feeding, and they're sometimes prohibited by local laws or landlord regulations. If you do have one, you're already doing better than many of your neighbours. Chickens present a different calculation. A laying hen provides eggs regularly, maybe not every day in winter when daylight is short, but often enough to matter. Eggs are protein. They're versatile. They can be eaten immediately or preserved in various ways. A chicken that lays even just twice a week through winter is providing around 60 eggs over the season, which is substantial nutrition. But chickens also need feeding, and grain that goes to chickens is grain not going to humans. As winter deepens and your grain supplies dwindle, you're recalculating constantly. Is the egg production worth the grain cost? Some chickens stop laying entirely in winter due to reduced daylight and cold stress. A non-laying chicken is just consuming resources while providing nothing, and that's when you start thinking about chicken stew. The meat from one chicken isn't much, maybe a few days of meat, if stretched in pottage, but it's something, and it stops the grain drain immediately. Here's where it gets psychologically complex. These aren't faceless farm animals. That chicken has probably been around for a year or more. You've fed it. It's roosted in your cottage for warmth. You've gotten used to its presence. Children have named it, probably. Killing it means confronting the reality of your situation, that you're desperate enough to eliminate future egg production for immediate calories. But sentimentality doesn't fill stomachs, so if the math says slaughter, you slaughter. Goats or cows, if you're fortunate enough to own one, are even more complicated. A milking animal provides dairy products regularly, milk, cheese, butter, which are complete proteins and crucial fats. The milk production drops in winter but doesn't stop entirely. A goat or cow also require significant feed, though they can survive on rougher forage than other animals. And they're expensive, representing wealth and status beyond just their food production. Slaughtering a milk animal is a last resort, something you do only when death by starvation is the alternative, because it eliminates an ongoing food source for one-time meat. Some families have sheep, which provide wool for clothing and eventually meat, though sheep are more commonly owned by wealthier peasants or managed communally. The wool alone makes sheep valuable. You need clothing to survive winter, and producing your own wool means one less expense. But a sheep that's slaughtered for mutton obviously stops producing wool, so again you're balancing immediate needs against future benefits. Then there's the question of working animals, oxen or horses used for ploughing and transport. These are almost never slaughtered for food, unless the situation is truly catastrophic, because without them you can't work your fields next year, which means no harvest, which means starvation. Regardless, a family that eats their ox is a family that's already given up on the future and is just trying to survive the present. It happens especially during famines, but it's recognized as a point of no return. These social and legal aspects complicate everything further. In many manorial systems, you don't fully own your animals. Your lord has rights to them or expects a portion if you slaughter. Killing a pig might require permission or payment. Poaching wild animals is definitely illegal and can result in severe punishment. But when you're starving, the risk calculus shifts. A rabbit snared illegally could mean the difference between your child living or dying. You're willing to risk a fine or even physical punishment for that chance. Wild game theoretically exists, deer, boar, rabbits, birds, but it's largely off-limits to peasants. The forest is the Lord's hunting preserve, and taking game from it is theft punishable harshly. The nobility is obsessively protective of hunting rights, because hunting is their primary recreation and status display. So you're surrounded by potential meat that you're legally prohibited from touching, which adds a layer of frustration to winter hunger. Some peasants risk it anyway, setting snares at night, fishing in restricted waters, taking birds' eggs from nests. The penalties if caught are severe, but starvation is also severe, so people make choices. Fish, where available, offer another option. Coastal or riverside communities have better access, and fish can be caught dried or salted for winter use. Inland peasants might have access to fish ponds, though these are often controlled by monasteries or lords. Dried fish, hard as wood, salty as the sea, becomes a valuable trade commodity. You might trade grain or labour for fish, diversifying your protein sources. Smoked herring or dried cod can be soaked and added to pottage, providing that crucial non-plant protein that keeps bodies functioning. There's also the harsh reality that not all animals make it through winter regardless of your decisions. Chickens die from cold or predators. Pigs get sick. Cattle suffer from inadequate feed and don't survive until spring. When an animal dies naturally, you're faced with another calculation: is the meat still safe to eat? If it died of disease consuming, it could make you sick or kill you. If it died of cold or starvation, and you find it quickly, the meat might be salvageable. These decisions require knowledge and judgment, and getting it wrong has serious consequences. Some families engage in informal animal sharing or trading. If your pig has just been slaughtered, and you have more meat than you can preserve or eat quickly, you might share some with neighbours with the understanding that they'll reciprocate when they slaughter theirs. This creates an informal meat distribution system that helps everyone survive winter with occasional fresh protein, rather than everyone eating their entire stock at once and then having nothing. The emotional weight of these decisions is real, even if medieval peasants are more accustomed to animal death than modern people. You've raised that pig from a piglet, you've cared for those chickens, that goat has been part of your household. Killing them for food is necessary and normal, but it's not without psychological cost. Children learn early that animals are both companions and food, a duality that shapes their entire worldview about life, death, and survival. Dairy in winter is a study in transformation and preservation, because fresh milk in freezing temperatures is both a blessing and a ticking clock. It must be processed immediately, or it becomes waste, and waste is unthinkable. If you're fortunate enough to have a cow or goat producing milk through winter, you're managing a continuous flow of liquid nutrition that demands constant attention and skill. First, let's be clear about winter milk production. It's dramatically reduced compared to spring and summer. Your cow or goat is surviving on poor quality hay-dried grasses and whatever supplementary feed you can provide from your grain stores. The animal is cold stressed and in survival mode, which means milk production drops by half or more. Where a well-fed spring cow might produce several gallons daily, your winter cow is giving maybe a gallon or less, and that's if you're lucky and the animal's healthy. But that small amount of milk is liquid gold. Fresh milk provides complete protein, fats, vitamins, and calcium nutritional completeness that your grain and root vegetable diet desperately lacks. The problem is that fresh milk spoils within hours at room temperature, faster in warmth, and even in winter cold it doesn't last more than a day or two before it starts to turn. So you can't store it fresh. You must transform it. Butter is your primary preservation method. You pour the fresh milk into a wide, shallow bowl or pan and let it sit in the coldest part of your dwelling, often near the door or in an unheated back area. The cream rises to the top overnight, forming a thick layer that you carefully skim off. This cream goes into your butter churner wooden barrel or ceramic crock with a plunger, and then begins the exhausting work of churning. Churning means moving that plunger up and down for what feels like hours. Your arms burn, your shoulders ache, the repetitive motion numbs your mind. Children often help with this task, taking turns when one person gets too tired. The cream sloshes and splashes inside the churn, and you keep working until suddenly, finally, the fat molecules begin clumping together, separating from the liquid. The transformation is almost magical. Liquid cream becomes solid butter and thin buttermilk. You drain off the buttermilk, which is immediately drunk or used in cooking, because it's still nutritious and has a pleasant tang. The butter gets worked with your hands or a wooden paddle, squeezing out remaining liquid, kneading it into a solid mass. Then comes the crucial step, salting. You work salt into the butter, lots of it, far more than modern taste would consider pleasant. This salt is what preserves the butter for months, preventing bacterial growth and rancidity. The salted butter gets packed into crocks, pressed down firmly to eliminate air pockets and sealed with a layer of salt on top or with cloth soaked in brine. Stored in a cool place, this butter will last through winter, though its flavour becomes increasingly salty and sharp as months pass. By February, your butter tastes more like salty fat than anything resembling fresh butter, but it's still calories, and it still enriches your pottage in ways that nothing else can. Cheese is the other major dairy preservation technique, and it's more complex, requiring specific knowledge and conditions. Fresh milk gets warmed gently, not boiled, just warm, and then you add your coagulant. This might be rennet traditionally made from the stomach lining of a calf, or it might be an acidic substance like vinegar, or the whey saved from previous cheese making. The milk begins to separate into curds and whey solid white clumps floating in greenish liquid. You cut the curds into smaller pieces, encouraging more whey to separate, then drain off that whey, which again gets used immediately fed to pigs or drunk by humans, because wasting nutrition is not an option. The curds get pressed to squeeze out remaining moisture, forming a solid mass. Salt gets worked in for preservation. Then the cheese must age sitting in a cool place for weeks or months while beneficial bacteria and molds work their transformative magic. Hard cheeses, the kind that last through winter, require significant aging and develop a firm texture and sharp, complex flavour. A wheel of well-aged cheese is dense nutrition, portable, long-lasting and tradable. You might have made several small wheels in autumn, when milk production was higher, and now you're carefully rationing them through winter, cutting thin slices that get added to bread or melted into pottage. Soft cheeses don't last as long but can be made more quickly. Fresh curds, lightly salted and formed into small rounds, will keep for a few weeks in cold conditions. These are more perishable, but also more pleasant to eat, less aggressively aged and salty than their hard-aged cousins. Some families make soft cheese weekly through winter, if milk production permits providing regular fresh dairy nutrition. There's also cottage cheese, or curd cheese, the simplest form where you just curdle milk, drain the whey, and eat the curds fresh with minimal processing. It's mild, soft, and must be consumed within days, but it's an easy way to preserve milk for a short period when you don't have time for full cheese making. The whey that's left over from cheese making is valuable in its own right. It contains protein, lactose, and minerals. It's basically milk with the fat and most of the protein removed. You can drink it straight, though it's thin and slightly sour. You can cook grains in it instead of water, adding nutrition to your porridge. You can feed it to pigs or chickens, improving their nutrition and thus their productivity. Some families make whey cheese by boiling whey down until the remaining proteins coagulate into a ricotta-like substance. It's a small amount of cheese from what would otherwise be waste, and every bit counts. Yogurt and similar fermented milk products exist in some regions, though they're not as universally common in medieval Europe as in other cultures. The principle is similar to cheese. Beneficial bacteria transform milk into something more stable and longer lasting. Fermented milk has a tangy flavour and thicker texture, and it lasts several days rather than hours. If you have access to the right bacterial cultures, often maintained through continuously culturing new batches, from old ones, fermented milk provides another preservation option. Now here's the dark side of winter dairy. It's labour-intensive at a time when you're already exhausted and underfed, and it requires giving your precious grain to animals rather than eating it yourself. Every scoop of oats that goes to your cow is a scoop you're not eating, and you're making that sacrifice based on the hope that the milk produced will be worth more than the grain consumed. Some winters that calculation works. Other winters, especially if the animal gets sick or milk production drops too low, you realise you've been feeding an animal for minimal return, and that realisation is bitter. There's also the challenge of keeping dairy animals alive through winter. Cows and goats need shelter from extreme cold, adequate water, which means breaking ice on water troughs daily, and enough nutrition to maintain body condition. An animal that's too thin and weak won't produce milk and might not survive until spring. But feeding them well enough to maintain production means diverting resources from human consumption. It's a constant balancing act with no perfect answers. Some peasants don't have dairy animals at all and must trade for dairy products. You might trade grain labour or preserved vegetables to a neighbour who has a cow receiving cheese or butter in return. This creates an informal economy where different families specialise in different food production strategies and everyone benefits through trade. But if you're on the poor end of the peasant spectrum, you might go entire winters without dairy, relying entirely on plant-based foods, supplemented with occasional meat. The taste of winter dairy is different from summer dairy in ways that go beyond just reduced quantity. Winter milk from animals eating dry hay has a different flavour, profile less rich, slightly different mineral content, paler in colour. The butter is paler too, almost white, instead of the golden yellow of summer butter, and everything tastes more strongly of salt by winter's end because you've been adding salt for preservation, and your palate has adjusted to higher sodium levels. Despite all the challenges, dairy products provide something your winter diet desperately needs: complete proteins and fats in forms that vegetables and grains simply can't match. A slice of cheese, a spoonful of butter melting into your pottage, a cup of fresh milk. These are treasures that make survival not just possible, but slightly more bearable. Ale is not a luxury in your medieval winter. It's a fundamental survival tool that you drink multiple times daily, and understanding why requires letting go of modern assumptions about beverages' hydration and what constitutes drinking. This isn't about getting drunk, though. That's a pleasant side effect when it happens. This is about calorie safety and staying alive when water itself can kill you. Let's start with the water problem. You don't have municipal water systems, no treatment plants, no chlorination, no understanding of germ theory. Your water comes from well streams or ponds, and it's contaminated with everything you can imagine and several things you'd rather not. Animal waste, human waste, that's seeped through soil, dead things, decomposing upstream parasites, bacteria. Medieval water is a dangerous substance. Drinking it raw is gambling with your intestines and potentially your life. Dysentery, cholera, and various parasitic infections are regular killers, and they all come from contaminated water. Boiling water would solve this, but boiling requires fuel, and fuel, whether it's wood peat or dried dung, is precious in winter. You can't boil every cup of water you need to drink throughout the day. The fuel cost would be astronomical. This is where ale becomes brilliant. The brewing process involves boiling, which kills pathogens, and then fermentation produces alcohol, which further inhibits bacterial growth. Ale is safe liquid in a world where safe liquid is genuinely hard to find. But the ale you're drinking daily isn't what modern people think of when they hear beer. This is small ale, or weak ale, very low alcohol content, maybe 2 or 3% at most, sometimes even less. It's barely alcoholic, more like bread-flavoured water than actual beer. You brew it specifically for daily consumption, using minimal grain short fermentation times, and producing large quantities of relatively thin, weak beverage. The brewing process happens regularly, usually weekly, and it's typically women's work, part of the endless cycle of household production. You start with grain. Barley is traditional for ale, though oats, wheat, or rye can also work. The grain gets malted, which means soaking it until it begins to sprout, then drying it to stop the sprouting. This malting process converts the grain's starches into sugars that yeast can ferment. You can malt your own grain, or trade for already malted barley if someone in your village specializes in that. The malted grain gets crushed coarsely. You're not making flour, just breaking it up, and then it goes into a large pot of water that you heat slowly. This is called mashing, and it's where the grain's sugars dissolve into the water, creating a sweet liquid called wort. You're using your precious fuel to heat this, but it's an investment in producing safe drinking liquid for the entire family for days to come. Once the wort is sweet enough, you test by tasting. Relying on experience rather than measurements, you strain out the spent grain which goes to feed animals, because again, nothing is wasted. The liquid gets boiled, which serves multiple purposes. It sterilizes the liquid, it concentrates the sugars slightly, and it's when you'd add hops or other flavorings if you have them. Hops are a relatively late addition to brewing. They become standard in later medieval period, but aren't universal in early medieval times. Before hops, brewers used various herb mixtures called gruit to add bitterness and act as preservatives. After boiling, the wort must cool before you can add yeast. In winter, this cooling happens relatively quickly. You just leave the pot outside or in an unheated area and wait. Once it's cool enough, warm to the touch but not hot, you add your yeast. This might be cultivated yeast you've kept from previous batches, or it might be wild yeast that just naturally occurs in your environment. Medieval brewers don't understand yeast as living organisms. That knowledge is centuries away, but they know that adding foamy stuff from the last batch makes the new batch ferment. Fermentation happens over a few days. The yeast consumes sugars and produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. The ale bubbles and froths, and your cottage smells distinctly of fermentation, a yeasty, slightly sour aroma that mixes with all the other smells of medieval living. When the vigorous bubbling slows, the ale is ready or ready enough. It's not aged or conditioned like modern craft beers. You're drinking it young, still slightly sweet, barely carbonated, full of suspended yeast particles that make it cloudy and thick. This weak ale provides several things your body needs. First calories, the residual sugars, and the alcohol itself are both caloric, adding to your daily energy intake in ways that plain water never could. In winter, when every calorie counts and you're borderline starving by February, the ale you drink represents a meaningful portion of your daily nutrition. Second, B vitamins from the yeast and grain, which help prevent certain deficiency diseases. Third, hydration in a safe form that won't make you sick. You drink it with every meal and between meals, probably consuming several pints daily. Children drink it too. The alcohol content is low enough that it's not intoxicating for them, and giving children contaminated water is far more dangerous than giving them weak ale. Pregnant women drink it. The elderly drink it. Ale is universal. There's also strong ale, which is higher alcohol content, properly aged and reserved for special occasions or trade. This is the ale you might drink at festivals that guests get served that you carefully store for celebrations. It's made with more grain, fermented longer, and results in something actually intoxicating, maybe 5 to 7% alcohol, similar to modern beers. Strong ale is valuable, tradable, and a sign of household prosperity. But you're not drinking strong ale daily because you can't afford to use that much grain on brewing when you need it for bread. The social aspect of ale is significant too. Ale brewing is a cottage industry, and women who brew particularly good ale might sell the surplus to neighbours, earning a bit of money or trading for other goods. The alewife is a recognised village role, and some households gain modest income from brewing. Churches and monasteries brew extensively, often producing the best ale in a region, because they have resources, knowledge, and quality control that peasant households can't match. When your ale runs out, which happens if you've miscalculated your grain supply, or if brewing has been interrupted, you're forced to drink water, and everyone knows that's risky. You might boil it first if you can spare the fuel, but often you just take your chances. The increase in illness when ale runs short is noticeable, reinforcing everyone's understanding that ale is essential, not optional. There's also mead in some regions, fermented honey, but honey's expensive and usually reserved for wealthier households or special occasions. Mead is sweeter, higher alcohol, and has a completely different flavour profile. If you've managed to keep bees or trade for honey, a small batch of mead might be fermenting in the corner, aging slowly, destined for a wedding or religious feast. But it's not your daily drink. Cider exists where apples grow abundantly, and it follows similar logic to ale. Take fruit, crush, it ferment the juice, and you've got safe caloric beverage that lasts through winter. Apple, cider, hard cider, always alcoholic, because that's how fermentation works, becomes a staple in orchard regions. It's tart, tangy, variable in quality depending on the apples and fermentation conditions, but it serves the same essential purpose as ale. The taste of your daily ale is acquired. It's flat, slightly sour yeasty, with a bread-like flavour and a thin, watery body. There's minimal bitterness if you haven't used hops, or an herbal complexity if you've used Groot. It's not refreshing in any modern sense. It's lukewarm, cloudy, and has bits of sediment floating in it. But after a cold morning of work, a wooden cup of ale feels like civilization, like you're still in control of something in a world that's mostly hostile and chaotic. You toast with it, you share it with neighbours, you pour a bit as offering when praying. Ale is woven into the social and spiritual fabric of your life, present at births, deaths, marriages, and every day in between. A household without ale is a household in crisis, and everyone knows it. Winter foraging sounds like a contradiction. How do you forage when everything's dead or dormant and the ground is frozen solid? But desperation breeds creativity, and secrets about winter landscapes that modern people have completely forgotten. The forest and fields still offer food if you know where to look, what to risk, and how to process things that don't immediately appear edible. Let's start with the frozen streams and ponds, because fish don't completely disappear. In winter, they just move deeper and slower, their cold-blooded metabolisms grinding down to minimal function. If you live near water, ice fishing becomes a genuine survival strategy. You chop a hole through the ice with whatever tools you have, an axe, a heavy stick, sheer determination, and then you wait with a line and hook, or you set traps beneath the ice, checking them daily. The fish you catch are sluggish, barely moving, easy to grab once you get them to the surface. Their thin fish are also surviving winter on minimal food, but they're proteined, they're something different from endless pottage, and they can be smoked or salted if you catch more than you can eat immediately. Some communities practice ice spearing, where you crouch over a hole in the ice with the spear and wait for fish to pass below, visible in the dark water. It requires patience, stillness, and tolerance for cold that borders on superhuman. Your hands go numb within minutes. Your knees ache from crouching. But when you successfully spear a pike or perch, the triumph feels disproportionate to the small amount of meat you've gained, because you've actively conquered winter, rather than just enduring it. Frozen berries still cling to certain bushes, rose hips especially, which actually improve after frost, becoming softer and sweeter. You pick them carefully, your fingers clumsy with cold, collecting enough to make a tart tea, or to stew with a bit of honey if you're feeling extravagant. Rose hips are packed with vitamin C, though you don't know that you just know they taste good, and seem to help people feel better during the dark months when illness is common. Hawthorn berries looking like tiny frozen apples on bare branches are edible if you're desperate enough. They're mealy bland, but they're there and they're free. You cook them into a paste or add them to pottage for bulk. Similarly, any apples still hanging on trees, usually shriveled, partially frozen, overlooked during harvest, get collected. They're not pleasant raw, but cooked down, they add sweetness and pectin to whatever you're making. Tree bark becomes a legitimate food source when things get truly desperate, and the knowledge of which trees and how to process them is passed down like precious secrets. Pine, birch and willow have inner bark, the cambium layer, just beneath the outer bark that's edible and even somewhat nutritious. You score the outer bark, carefully peel it back and scrape away the inner layer, which is soft, slightly sweet and fibrous. This gets dried and ground into a powder that you mix with your grain flour, extending your bread supplies. The resulting bread tastes distinctly of forest resinous woody strange, but it fills bellies when grain runs short. Birch trees offer another gift if you tap them in late winter. When sap starts to flow, you can collect birch sap, which is slightly sweet, and can be drunk fresh or boiled down into a syrup. It's nowhere near as productive as maple syrup production. You need many more trees to get useful amounts, but every bit of sweetness and liquid nutrition matters. Nuts buried by squirrels in autumn are potential treasure if you can find them. Squirrels have better memory than people give them credit for, but they don't retrieve every cached nut, so some remain hidden under snow and leaves. Hazelnuts, especially hard-shelled, small, easy to miss, might be discovered while doing other winter foraging. Finding a squirrel's cache feels like discovering pirate treasure, a handful of nuts, representing concentrated fat and protein. Certain mushrooms survive winter, or appear during brief thaws. Winter chanterelles, velvet shank mushrooms, and a few others are adapted to cold weather, and can be found on dead wood or in sheltered spots even in freezing conditions. But mushroom foraging is dangerous. The stakes are literally life and death, because poisonous mushrooms will kill you just as dead in winter as in autumn. You only collect mushrooms you're absolutely certain about, which means sticking to a few well-known species that your family has been gathering for generations. Bark and twigs from certain trees, willow especially, get chewed for their medicinal properties. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the compound that inspired aspirin, though obviously you don't know the chemistry. You just know that chewing willow bark helps with pain and fever, so you gather it when you can and keep some dried in your cottage for when illness strikes. Dead grasses and seed heads sticking up through snow might still have edible seeds clinging to them. You're talking about tiny amounts. You might spend an hour collecting seeds that weigh less than a handful, but in February, when you're truly desperate, even small amounts matter. These seeds can be ground and added to porridge or bread, providing texture and minimal nutrition. Lichen growing on rocks and trees is theoretically edible, though it requires extensive processing to remove bitter compounds and make it palatable. Some northern cultures traditionally used lichen as emergency food, boiling it, repeatedly drying it, grinding it into powder. The result is barely food, more like fibrous material that won't actively kill you, but it keeps people alive during famines when nothing else remains. Wild garlic, if you know where patches grow, might still have some viable bulbs underground, accessible if you can dig through frozen soil. The bulbs are smaller and more pungent than in summer, but they add crucial flavour to your bland winter diet, and have antimicrobial properties that might help prevent illness. Even the dried frozen leaves can be collected and added to soup for a bit of green and a sharp, garlicky bite. Root vegetables that escaped harvest gone feral essentially might be findable if you know the old field boundaries and where people typically planted. Turnips and carrots that got missed or were considered too small to bother with in autumn might still be in the ground, frozen solid but revivable through slow thawing and cooking. They're often damaged, partially rotted, but the good portions are salvageable. Nettles, believe it or not, have dried brown stems standing through winter, and some foragers collect these to reconstitute in water. They're nowhere near as nutritious as fresh spring nettles, but they add a mineral-rich green element to winter pottage when fresh greens are impossible to find. You wear gloves or wrap your hands in cloth because even dead nettle stems can sting. Animal tracking becomes food finding. Following rabbit or hare tracks in snow might lead you to their burrows or paths where you can set snares. This is technically illegal poaching, but you're weighing legal risk against starvation risk, and sometimes starvation wins. A snared rabbit is several days of meat, and the fur is useful too. You check your snares daily carefully, hoping but not expecting. And when you find one successful, the relief is overwhelming. Bird trapping is another illegal but practiced winter activity. Small birds, sparrows, finches, anything really can be caught with simple traps or knocked down with thrown stones if you're skilled and lucky. Each bird is a tiny amount of meat, barely a mouthful, but when you're feeding children who are visibly wasting away, you'll trap every bird you can catch. They get plucked, gutted, and thrown whole into the pottage pot bones and all to extract every molecule of nutrition. Eggs from wild birds are impossible to find in winter. Birds aren't nesting, but birds themselves might roost in accessible places, especially during the worst cold snaps when they're desperately seeking shelter. A barn or outbuilding might harbour roosting birds that you can catch at night when they're torpid from cold. It feels unfair catching sleeping birds, but survival isn't about fairness. Some foragers know which fungi grow on dead wood and can be collected even in snow bracket fungi and certain tough polypores, and while these aren't tender or delicious, they can be boiled to extract nutrients and flavour, creating a mushroom broth that enriches pottage. The fungi themselves become too tough to eat, but the cooking liquid carries flavour and minerals. The work of winter foraging is exhausting often for minimal return, but it serves psychological purposes beyond just food. It gives you something to do besides sitting in your cold cottage watching your food stores diminish. It makes you feel active, in control, still fighting. And occasionally, not often, but sometimes you find something genuinely helpful, something that stretches your supplies just enough to make the difference between surviving and starving. The wealth gap in medieval winter isn't just visible, it's edible. And nowhere is the brutal reality of feudal hierarchy more obvious than at mealtime. While you're stretching thin pottage and gnawing stale rye bread, your lord is sitting at a trestle table, groaning under the weight of roasted meats, white bread, imported spices and wine. Let's talk about that, because understanding the inequality helps explain why peasant revolts keep happening and why resentment simmers just below the surface of medieval society. Your lord's winter meal, let's say dinner. The main meal of the day, eaten around midday, starts with white bread. Not the dark, dense rye you eat, but actual wheat bread, fine-milled, relatively soft, almost fluffy. This bread is a status symbol before it's even eaten. White bread requires wheat, which is more expensive than rye. It requires fine milling, usually done at well-maintained mills with quality stones. It requires skilled bakers and proper ovens. Each slice represents resources that you'll never access. The Lord's table includes multiple courses of meat. Roasted venison from deer hunted in the forest that you're prohibited from entering. Wild boar, its flesh, dark and rich, basted with expensive fats. Domestic pork from pigs that were fed better than your children. Beef from cattle that weren't worked to exhaustion in fields. Chicken, duck, goose poultry variety that you might see once or twice a year if you're lucky. The portions are enormous by your standards. Plates piled with meat that could feed your family for a week. The meat comes with sauces. Actual sauces made from wine vinegar. Expensive imported spices like pepper, ginger, cinnamon. These spices cost more than you earn in months. A pinch of pepper represents a day's wages. Cinnamon is genuinely exotic, shipped from the other side of the known world, worth its weight in silver. The Lord uses these spices casually flavouring his food without a second thought while you're making your turnip pottage taste slightly less miserable. With dried thyme you grew yourself. Fresh fish appears on the Lord's table even in winter. Preserved fish, yes, but also fresh fish from stocked fish ponds carefully managed to provide year-round supply. Pike carp eels, varieties that survive winter well and can be caught from estate ponds. These fish are larger and better fed than anything you might catch from a frozen stream. They're prepared elaborately, sometimes in aspic, sometimes in complex gravies, always presented beautifully. Dairy on the Lord's table is abundant and varied. Fresh cheese, including soft varieties that don't keep long because the estate has enough dairy production to make fresh cheese in winter. Butter used liberally, not rationed by the crystal of salt like in your household. Cream sauces, custards, dishes that require amounts of milk and eggs that would represent weeks of production from your single cow. The Lord drinks wine, actual wine imported from France, or further stored in barrels served in metal or glass cups. Wine represents sophistication, civilization, connection to Roman traditions and Mediterranean culture. Meanwhile, you're drinking weak ale from a wooden cup and considering yourself fortunate to have that much. On special occasions, the Lord might drink mead sweetened with honey and spiced, or hippocras, which is spiced wine sweetened and filtered. These are luxury beverages that exist in a completely different universe from your daily ale. Vegetables on the noble table are more varied and better prepared. They have access to whatever's stored best first pick of the harvest. Their root vegetables are the largest and least damaged. They might have preserved fruits, dried figs, raisins, dates imported from Mediterranean regions that appear in dishes or are eaten as delicacies. Apple tarts, pear compotes, fruit preserved in honey or wine. You're eating wrinkled turnips. They're eating spiced fruit pastries. The portions are extravagant. A noble meal includes more food than you'd eat in several days. And here's the thing that's hardest to swallow. Much of this food gets wasted. Not all of it gets eaten. Leftovers go to servants, get fed to hunting dogs, or sometimes just get thrown away. The casual waste of food that could keep your family alive for days happens regularly at the Lord's table, and everyone knows it. Servants eat better than you do too. Not as well as the Lord, there's definitely a hierarchy, but they get access to kitchen scraps, leftover meats, bread that's slightly stale, but still white flour ale that's stronger than what you brew. A servant in a noble household is genuinely better fed than an independent peasant, which is why some people accept servitude rather than trying to maintain their own household. The Lord's Hall is warmer too. Massive fireplaces burn constantly, fed by wood from the estate forests, the same forests you're prohibited from cutting in without permission. The Lord doesn't ration firewood. There's no calculation about whether heating is worth the fuel cost. It's just warm constantly, extravagantly warm. Meanwhile, you're burning every piece of fuel, carefully making it last, accepting cold as the default state. Feast days amplify these differences exponentially. Christmas at the Lord's Hall includes spectacular displays, whole roasted animals, elaborate dishes, entertainment, excessive drinking. The 12 days of Christmas are literally 12 days of feasting for the nobility, continuous celebration, with barely a pause between meals. You might get a slightly better meal on Christmas, maybe some extra meat, a bit of white bread from church charity, but you're mostly still eating pottage and watching your stores diminish while the Lord celebrates in ways that seem almost obscene. Historians still argue about whether medieval peasants deeply resented this inequality or accepted it as natural hierarchy ordained by God. The reality is probably complex and individual. Some people genuinely believed the social order was divinely ordained. Others seethed with resentment but kept quiet out of necessity. Still others fell somewhere in between. But when you're watching your children go hungry while the Lord's hunting dogs eat meat, it's hard not to question the justice of the arrangement. The legal structure reinforces all of this. You're required to give a portion of your harvest to the Lord as rent. You must work a certain number of days in the Lord's fields, labor that doesn't feed your own family. You pay fees to use the Lord's mill oven, even sometimes the Lord's bull for breeding your cow. The system is designed to concentrate resources upward, ensuring the Lord eats well while you survive marginally. Poaching laws exist specifically to preserve game for noble hunting and noble tables. The penalty for killing a deer can be severe mutilation, prison, even death in extreme cases. The forest is full of food, but that food is legally reserved for people who already have plenty. The irony and injustice of this is not lost on you, even if openly expressing those thoughts would be dangerous. There are occasional moments of redistribution religious obligations for charity customs that require the Lord to provide ale or food during certain communal workdays almsgiving that channels some wealth downward. But these are drops in an ocean of inequality. The fundamental structure ensures that those who produce food often go hungry, while those who own land feast. Some nobles are better than others, more generous, more aware of their responsibilities to their tenants, more willing to provide aid during hardship. But even the best lord is still eating vastly better than you are still living in comfort, while you freeze still embodying a system where your labour enriches someone else's table. And the worst lords, extractive, cruel, indifferent to suffering, make the inequality feel like deliberate malice rather than just structural reality. This comparison sits in your mind during your own meagre meals. You try not to think about it too much, dwelling on injustice. You can't change is corrosive to the soul, but sometimes breaking off a piece of hard rye bread and dunking it in watery pottage, you can't help but imagine what venison tastes like, what white bread feels like in your mouth, what it's like to eat until you're full, rather than eating until the food runs out. When food is scarce, every society reveals its moral priorities through who eats first and who eats most, and in medieval winter, the allocation of food becomes an ethical calculation that weighs survival, odds, future utility, and raw love against the mathematical reality that not everyone can eat equally when there isn't enough. You're making decisions daily that feel like playing God, and the weight of it never fully lifts. Children get priority in most households, and the reasoning is both practical and emotional. Practically, children have less body mass and fewer caloric reserves. They'll die of starvation faster than adults. A week of inadequate food that leaves an adult weak but functional might kill a small child. Emotionally, they're children, and every parent instinct screams to feed them first, to give them your portion if necessary to ensure they survive even if you don't. So the heartiest bits of the pottage chunks of meat, if any exists, the thickest portions where vegetables have accumulated go to the children. But there are complications even within this priority. Infants still nursing draw nutrition directly from their mother, which means the mother must eat adequately, or her milk production fails and the infant dies. So nursing mothers receive extra portions, not for themselves exactly, but as vessels for infant nutrition. This can create tension when food is desperately short. Why does she get more when everyone else is hungry? But the logic is undeniable. Starve the mother, and you starve the infant she's feeding. Toddlers and young children, who are weaned but still small, get the next priority. They're fed first, fed more frequently, encouraged to eat even when they're not particularly hungry. You're trying to build their body reserves for the remainder of winter, knowing that if March arrives and they're already weakened, they won't survive the final hard weeks before spring. Older children, adolescents who are nearly adult-sized, fall into a complicated middle category. They need significant calories because they're still growing, but they're also old enough to understand scarcity and to consciously eat less to help younger siblings. This self-sacrifice is praised and encouraged, creating a culture where older children learn to endure hunger so smaller ones can eat. It builds character, supposedly, though it also builds resentment and permanent psychological scars around food and fairness. The elderly represent the most ethically fraught category. Grandparents, great-aunts, age uncles living with the family, these people often receive smaller portions or food of lower quality. The reasoning is brutal but pragmatic. They've lived their lives, they're no longer productive labourers, and in survival situations, resources go to those with the best chance of long-term survival. An 80-year-old who dies of starvation has lost fewer years than a 5-year-old who dies of the same cause. But this calculation isn't made coldly or without emotional cost. You love your elderly parents. They raised you. They taught you everything you know. They're repositories of family history and practical knowledge. Watching them slowly waste away while you give their food to your children is agonizing. Some elderly people refuse food voluntarily, insisting the young eat instead, and their nobility breaks your heart even as you accept their sacrifice. Others cling to life with desperation, demanding their share, creating family conflict that adds psychological torment to physical hunger. The weak and chronically ill face similar difficult calculations. Someone who's been sickly all winter, who hasn't recovered despite care, who shows no signs of improvement. Do you continue feeding them the same portions as healthy family members, or do you quietly reduce their share, accepting that they're unlikely to survive anyway, and redirecting resources to those with better odds? It's triage logic, the same calculation field medics make in wartime, but you're making it about your own family members in your own home. Sometimes people die, and their death solves the food shortage problem by reducing the number of mouths to feed. There's relief mixed with grief. You're sad they died, but you're also aware that everyone else's survival odds just improved. This duality of emotion is something modern people rarely experience, and it's corrosive to psychological well-being in ways that echo through generations. Adult men who do heavy physical labor, ploughing when the ground thaws, chopping firewood, hauling supplies, need significant calories to function. A man doing hard physical work in cold conditions can burn 4,000 or more calories daily, and if he's not fed adequately, he can't work, which means necessary tasks don't get done, which threatens the family's future survival. So working men often receive relatively large portions, not because they're valued more as people, but because they're crucial economic engines. This can feel unfair to women doing equally exhausting but less visibly physical work, but the reality is that certain tasks require specific caloric input to accomplish. Women's labour, cooking, preservation, textile work, child-rearing, managing the household is constant and essential, but doesn't always receive the same caloric recognition. Women often eat last and list taking whatever remains after men and children have eaten. This isn't universal. Some households are more egalitarian, but it's common enough to be a pattern. The justification is that women's work, while essential, is less calorically demanding than male field labour, so they can function on less food. Whether this is actually true or just convenient rationalisation is debatable. Pregnant women need extra nutrition for the developing fetus, but they're not always prioritised, especially if the pregnancy isn't far along or isn't yet showing. A woman who's 3 months pregnant looks like every other woman, and in desperate times might not receive extra food because the need isn't visible. This leads to miscarriages, stillbirths, and infants born dangerously underweight, perpetuating cycles of malnutrition across generations. Social status within the household matters too. The head of household, usually the oldest productive male, often eats first and gets choice portions, not necessarily because he does the most work, but because patriarchal structures grant him authority and privilege. This is less pronounced in desperate poverty, where survival trumps hierarchy, but in households that aren't quite at starvation level, traditional structures persist. There are moments of profound sacrifice and equally profound selfishness. A mother who gives her entire portion to her children, going days with only water and scraps, demonstrating love that's almost holy in its selflessness. A father who hoards food, eating in secret, prioritizing his own survival over his family's, creating resentment that never fully heals. A child who steals food from younger siblings, acting on impulse and hunger, and then living with guilt forever. Communities sometimes step in when individual families can't cope. Neighbors share food, informally evening out inequalities, ensuring that no family starves while others have surplus. The village might collectively support widows, orphans, or the elderly who have no family to care for them. This communal support is both beautiful and insufficient. It helps, but it doesn't solve underlying scarcity. The church preaches charity and care for the vulnerable, and monasteries do distribute alms, providing some safety net. But church resources are limited, unevenly distributed, and often come with expectations of piety and gratitude that feel like additional burdens. A hungry person receiving charity bread is supposed to be grateful and humble, not resentful about the inequality that made charity necessary. Feast days create temporary inversions of priority. On Christmas or Easter, everyone, even the weakest, the oldest, the sickest, gets a better meal. For one day, scarcity is suspended or at least minimized, and everyone eats something special. These days are psychologically crucial moments of relief and normalcy that remind you that life isn't always desperate struggle. They're also strategic. One good meal can boost morale and health enough to carry people through additional weeks of hardship. The decisions about who eats and how much are made continuously, multiple times daily, weighing variables that include hunger levels, work demands, health status, age, future prospects, and emotional bonds. You're constantly recalculating, trying to optimize survival for the maximum number of people. Some days you get it right. Other days someone goes to bed hungry who shouldn't have, or someone eats more than they needed while others starved. The guilt from these miscalculations lingers, and through it all love complicates everything. Pure utilitarian calculation would allocate food strictly by survival probability and economic productivity. But you can't watch your mother slowly starve without giving her extra portions, even if logic says those calories should go elsewhere. You can't let your youngest child cry from hunger without giving them your own food, even if it leaves you dangerously weak. Love makes you deviate from optimal strategy, and maybe that's what makes you human, rather than just survival machines. The monastery bell ringing across frozen fields means different things to different people. For some, it's a call to prayer. For others, it's the sound of potential salvation, because monasteries and religious houses are the closest thing medieval society has to organized famine relief. When your own stores fail completely, when every option has been exhausted, the church represents a last hope that's part spiritual comfort and part literal food distribution. Though accessing the charity requires navigating a complex system of obligation, humility, and religious expectation, monasteries are wealthier than most individual lords with extensive lands, organized agricultural systems, and centuries of accumulated resources. They brew beer in large quantities, bake bread daily, maintain fish ponds, keep livestock, and generally operate as highly efficient food production centers. More importantly, they're bound by religious obligation to practice charity feeding. The hungry is explicitly commanded in Scripture, and monasteries take this duty seriously. though the practical implementation varies wildly, depending on the specific order, the abbot's personality, and the monastery's own resources. The standard monastic charity is bread and ale distributed at the monastery gate on designated days. You arrive often having walked significant distances because monasteries aren't in every village, and join a queue of other desperate people. The poorer, the elderly, travelling pilgrims, local families facing crisis, everyone lines up together united by need. A monk oversees the distribution, sometimes offering blessings or brief prayers along with the food. You receive a loaf of bread, usually dark bread, not the fine white bread the monks themselves eat, but still bread and a measure of ale. This might be your only substantial food for days. The bread is often monastery seconds, slightly burned, a day or two old, made from coarser flour, but it's still properly made bread from a well-functioning oven, often better quality than what you make at home. The ale is weak, suitable for daily consumption rather than intoxication, but it's safe liquid and it contains calories. These distributions happen regularly, sometimes daily, sometimes weekly, depending on the monastery's resources and policies. Some monasteries maintain formal almonry systems, dedicated buildings or rooms, where charity is organised and distributed. An almoner monk specialises in this work, managing resources, assessing need, determining who receives what. Good almoners develop reputations, and people will travel farther to reach monasteries known for generous, consistent charity. Poor almoners, those who are stingy, judgmental, or irregular in distribution, create resentment and sometimes genuine hardship when people arrive expecting help that doesn't materialize. Beyond basic bread and ale, some monasteries offer more substantial support during extreme crisis. A hospice where sick or elderly travelers can rest, receive care, and eat several meals. Guest houses where pilgrims and travelers stay overnight fed and sheltered. These aren't available to everyone, they're primarily for people traveling for religious reasons, but the definitions can be flexible when someone's genuinely desperate. Monasteries also distribute broken meats, leftovers from the monks' own meals. The monastic diet is actually quite good, often better than noble diets, because religious rules about feast and fast days create variety. Monks eat fish regularly, have access to better vegetables, consume cheese and egg frequently. Their leftovers stale bread soaked in broth, fish bones with bits of meat still clinging vegetable scraps. Cheese rinds are genuine treasures to starving people. What monks consider waste is feast material to you. The emotional experience of accepting monastic charity is complicated. There's gratitude, obviously someone's feeding you when you have nothing, but there's also humiliation in the dependency and standing in line publicly announcing your failure to provide for yourself in accepting food that's literally leftovers and scraps. The monks, for their part, are supposed to give with humility and grace, viewing charity as service to God rather than condescension to inferiors. Some monks genuinely embody this ideal. Others make you feel small, unworthy, sinful, as if your poverty is divine punishment that charity momentarily alleviates but doesn't address. Religious expectations accompany the charity. You're expected to pray, to attend Mass, if you're physically able to demonstrate piety and gratitude. Some monasteries require attendance at services before distributing food. You must sit through morning prayers before receiving bread. This isn't always cruel calculation. From the monastic perspective, they're providing spiritual food, alongside physical sustenance, nourishing soul and body together. But when you're desperately hungry, sitting through an hour of Latin prayers you don't understand before eating feels like an additional burden even if you're genuinely religious. Different monastic orders have different reputations for charity. Cistercians, with their emphasis on manual labour and self-sufficiency, often have more resources to share and take charitable obligations seriously. Benedictines, following their rule's emphasis on hospitality, maintain guest houses and distribute alms regularly. Franciscans, bound by poverty vows, have less material wealth, but are known for working directly with the poor, sharing what little they have. Carthusians, focused on contemplation and isolation, offer less consistent charity because they're deliberately withdrawn from society. Some monasteries operate what amounts to medieval soup kitchens, large pots of thin stew or pottage available to anyone who appears. You bring your own bowl, you wait your turn, a monk ladles out a portion you eat standing outside the monastery gate or sitting on the cold ground. The food is basic vegetable pottage, maybe with some grain, rarely with meat, but it's hot and it's free and it's yours without obligation beyond basic prayer. Hospitals, medieval hospitals, which are more hospices than medical facilities, are often connected to monasteries or religious orders. They provide care for the sick poor, which includes feeding them. The food is intentionally mild and nourishing broths, soft breads, weak wine or ale designed to help recovery. If you're sick and desperate, gaining admission to a hospital means guaranteed food for the duration of your stay, which might be the best eating you'll do all winter. The Church also organises charity through parish priests, though this is less consistent than monastic distribution. A parish might collect tithes, technically mandatory taxes on agricultural production, and the priest is supposed to use a portion for local charity. In practice, this varies enormously. Some priests are generous, using church resources to help parishioners through hard times. Others are corrupt or indifferent, hoarding resources or using them for personal benefit. Your experience of church charity depends heavily on whether your local priest is saint or scoundrel. Feast days bring special distributions. Christmas, Easter, and other major holy days often include enhanced charity, better quality bread, actual meat, larger portions. Some wealthy donors give money to monasteries specifically for feast day distributions, creating temporary abundance even for the poor. These days are deeply anticipated, marking time through winter and providing psychological as well as physical relief. There's also informal charity monks personally giving food to individuals they encounter, priests sharing meals with struggling parishioners, religious houses responding to specific emergencies. A family whose house burned down might receive sustained support from the local monastery for weeks or months. A widow with children might get regular distributions beyond the normal charity schedule. This personalized assistance requires visibility and connection. You need to be known to have some relationship with the religious institution, but when it happens, it can be life-saving. The theology underlying all this charity is complex. You're supposed to view poverty as potentially holy. Christ was poor, the apostles were poor, voluntary poverty is a path to sanctity. But involuntary poverty, the kind that threatens your life, is also seen as suffering that should be alleviated. The tension between these views, poverty as spiritual gift versus poverty as problem requiring solution, creates interesting dynamics in how charity is given and received. Some recipients of charity become permanent fixtures, professional beggars who survive entirely on religious distributions. They develop expertise in which monasteries are generous, what times distributions happen, how to present themselves for maximum sympathy. They're simultaneously pitiable and slightly scorned, seen as having given up on self-sufficiency. You might become one of them if things get desperate enough, and the thought is both frightening and somehow reassuring. At least there's a bottom level of survival, a floor below which the Church won't let you fall. The quantity of charity varies with the monastery's own situation. A rich, well-endowed abbey can be generous almost indefinitely. A small, poor monastery might have limited resources and must ration charity, carefully helping fewer people or distributing smaller portions. During widespread famine, even wealthy monasteries can be overwhelmed, unable to feed everyone who comes, begging, forced to make their own triage decisions about who gets help. And always underlying everything is gratitude mixed with dependence. The church feeds you when you're starving, which creates genuine thankfulness and also binds you more tightly to religious authority. You're less likely to question or resist an institution that literally keeps you alive. Whether this is cynical manipulation or genuine Christian charity, or both simultaneously, depends partly on perspective and partly on the specific religious house and individuals involved. The calendar isn't just about marking time, it's about survival strategy, because certain feast days punctuate the grim monotony of winter with moments of genuine abundance that are both celebration and calculated relief valve for people teetering on the edge of starvation. These aren't optional parties. They're psychologically essential breaks in the relentless scarcity days when even the poorest peasant eats something beyond survival rations, and understanding the feast calendar is understanding how medieval society structured hope through the darkest months. Christmas is the big one, the 12-day explosion of relative abundance that starts December 25th and runs through Epiphany on January 6th. This isn't one meal, it's nearly 2 weeks of elevated eating, a sustained break from winter austerity that's both religious celebration and practical calorie boost. For the nobility, it's extravagant feasting. For you, it's more modest, but still significantly better than your daily reality. The preparation for Christmas begins weeks earlier with the autumn pig slaughter, often timed specifically to provide Christmas meat. If your family has managed to keep a pig through, autumn feeding it scraps and forage watching it fatten. December is when that investment pays off. The slaughter is deliberate timed so the meat is still relatively fresh for Christmas, rather than months into preservation. You've been eating preserved food since November, so having something closer to fresh is genuinely special. The Christmas meal includes pork, maybe roasted, maybe in a rich stew with actual fat floating on top, the luxury of protein and fat together. There's white bread if you've managed to save wheat, or if the church has distributed it as charity. Butter appears more liberally, not rationed to the crystal. Cheese gets eaten in larger portions. If you've been hoarding eggs from chickens that sporadically lay those eggs become custards, or get baked into special breads. Dried fruits if you have any emerge from storage. Raisins, dried apples, maybe prunes sweetened with honey if you're fortunate. These get baked into special cakes or eaten as treats, explosions of sweetness in diets that have been relentlessly bland for weeks. Children especially benefit, their faces light up at honey-sweetened treats in ways that remind you why you endure everything else. Ale is stronger and more plentiful during Christmas. You've perhaps been saving some better brewed ale specifically for this period, or the monastery has distributed stronger drink or neighbours are sharing their best batches. The slight intoxication, the warmth spreading through cold, stressed bodies, the loosening of constant tensions, this is medicine as much as celebration. The 12 days aren't uniformly abundant. You can't sustain feast-level eating for 12 straight days, but there's elevated consumption, less harsh rationing, permission to eat until satisfied rather than stopping when the food runs out. It's psychologically crucial. 12 days of relief prove that winter won't last forever, that abundance is still possible, that there are things worth enduring for. Epiphany on January 6th often includes special cakes or breads, with surprises baked inside a bean, a coin, something hidden. Finding it makes you king or queen for the day, a moment of playfulness and inversion of normal hierarchy. It's a small thing, but in the grinding sameness of winter, these small celebrations matter enormously. Then comes the long, hard stretch from Epiphany to Easter, potentially 3 months, with no major feast days, just relentless Lent, with its fasting requirements making an already difficult situation worse. This is when winter truly tests you, when the Christmas food is long gone and Easter feels impossibly distant. Candlemas on February the 2nd offers a minor break. Blessed candles, perhaps some special bread religious ceremonies that at least provide distraction and community gathering. It's not a feast day with abundant food, but it's a marker waypoint proving you're making progress through winter. Shrove Tuesday, the day before Lent begins, is your last chance for richness before 40 days of fasting. If you have any remaining eggs, butter or fat, this is when you use them making pancakes or rich breads. Consuming the last of anything indulgent before Lent forbids it. It's strategic depletion. Use up perishable luxury items before the fast rather than watching them spoil during the weeks you can't eat them. Lent itself, 40 days before Easter, usually falling in late winter, imposes religious fasting that makes your already inadequate diet even more restrictive. No meat, no dairy, limited quantities generally. The theology is about spiritual discipline and identifying with Christ's suffering, but the practical reality is that you're now religiously obligated to eat even less during the period when your stores are most depleted and your body most needs calories. Different regions and social classes interpret Lenten fasting differently. Strict observance means no meat, eggs, dairy, or animal products at all, basically an enforced vegan diet, in an era when plant-based nutrition through winter is already inadequate. More lenient interpretations allow fish or permit dairy on certain days, or create exceptions for the sick and elderly. Your actual observance depends partly on personal piety, partly on what you can afford, and partly on whether local priests are strict or understanding about enforcement. Some people genuinely suffer during Lent, already malnourished peasants. Cutting back further can develop serious health problems. Others see minimal change because they weren't eating meat or dairy anyway, so the religious restriction doesn't alter their practical diet. Wealthier people can afford expensive fish and elaborate meatless dishes that make Lenten fasting less onerous, which creates another visible inequality. Easter, when it finally arrives, usually in late March or April, is explosive celebration and genuine relief. The fast ends, you can eat meat again. Spring is visibly arriving with new plant growth, and psychologically you've survived the worst of winter. The Easter meal often includes egg, symbol of rebirth, practical, because chickens start laying more frequently with increasing daylight, and lamb if your community can afford it, or at least some kind of meat after weeks without. Easter coincides roughly with the first spring greens, emerging wild garlic, early nettles, the first shoots of cultivated vegetables. These fresh greens taste like life itself after months of preserved foods. Your body craves them, desperately needing the vitamins and minerals they provide. The Easter meal might include a salad of these first greens, each bitter, fresh bite, undoing months of nutritional deficiency. Pentecost. 50 days after Easter brings another feast, though. By then you're into late spring or early summer, and the crisis has passed. But it's still a marker, still a celebration, still an excuse for community gathering and better eating. The feast day pattern serves multiple purposes beyond religious observance. Psychologically, it breaks time into manageable chunks. You're not surviving until spring, you're surviving until Christmas, then until Epiphany, then until Easter. Each feast day is a goal, a concrete achievement, proof of progress. Socially, feast days bring communities together, reinforcing bonds that help everyone survive through collective support. Nutritionally, the elevated eating provides crucial calorie and nutrient boosts at strategic times. The anticipation of feast days sustains you through the hardest moments. When February is grinding you down and death seems preferable to continued hunger, you think about Easter. Imagine the taste of fresh greens and eggs, count the days remaining. That future feast still weeks away but definitely coming gives you reason to endure one more day, then another, then another. And when the feast finally arrives, the joy is disproportionate to the actual food consumed. You're not just eating a better meal. You're celebrating survival-affirming community, participating in traditions that connect you to ancestors who also endured marking time in a world where time otherwise feels like an endless frozen present. The feast proves that change is possible, that winter doesn't last forever, that suffering has limits. March is the cruelest month. Forget what the poets say about April, because by March you've already survived 4 months of winter. Your stores are almost gone. Your body is weakened, and spring remains a promise that feels more like a taunt than a reality. This is the hunger moon stretched to its breaking point, the month when people who made it through December and January finally collapse when decisions become genuinely life or death, and when you understand viscerally that survival is never guaranteed until you're actually holding fresh food in your hands. Your grain situation by March is desperate. Those sacks that were full in November, still substantial in January, noticeably depleted in February, are now mostly empty. You're scraping the bottom, collecting the broken grains and chaff that settled at the base, grinding everything, including pieces you'd have rejected as too damaged or too small earlier. The flour you produce now is gritty, full of impurities, barely qualifies as flour, but it's what you have and you use it. Rationing becomes mathematical to the point of absurdity. You count individual grains, sometimes literally calculating how many oats or barley grains per person per day, trying to make the remaining supply stretch until the first spring harvest, which might be late April for early greens, May for serious vegetables, June for grain. You're potentially looking at 3 more months of this, and the math isn't adding up favourably. The root vegetables remaining in storage are in terrible condition, sprouting soft, showing significant rot that you cut away with increasingly less discrimination about what's too rotten. A turnip that's half decayed. You cut away the worst parts and eat the rest. Carrots that have gone rubbery and begun fermenting. Into the pot they go cooked until soft, providing something approaching nutrition even if the flavour is aggressively off. You're now eating things that would have been animal feed in November. Grain that's mouldy gets scraped of visible mould and used anyway because the alternative is nothing. Vegetables that are clearly past their prime, that smell vaguely wrong, get cooked thoroughly on the theory that heat will kill whatever's making them questionable. Sometimes this works. Sometimes people get sick, stomach cramps, diarrhea, vomiting, which is catastrophic, because illness in a malnourished body can spiral into death quickly. The preserved meat, if any remains, is more salt than protein at this point. You've been soaking and re-soaking these pieces to make them edible, and they've contributed more flavour memory than actual nutrition for weeks. The salt itself has been precious, though you've been reusing the brine, adding more salt periodically, creating preservation liquid that's saturated beyond what any bacteria could survive. Dairy production from your cow or goat, if you have one, is at its absolute lowest. The animal is surviving on the worst quality hay, is thin and stressed and producing minimal milk. Every drop is precious, carefully allocated, often going entirely to children or nursing mothers while everyone else goes without. Your own body is showing the effects of months of inadequate nutrition. You're thinner. Everyone is thinner. Your clothes hang loose, belts cinched tighter than they've ever been. Your face is gaunt, cheekbones, prominent eyes sunken. You tire easily, feel cold constantly despite any external temperature. Experience brain fog that makes even simple tasks difficult. Wounds heal slowly. Illnesses that would normally be minor become serious threats. Your immune system, deprived of adequate nutrition, can't mount effective defenses. Children are visibly suffering. Their growth has stalled or reversed. They're actually smaller than they were in autumn. In some cases, their bodies consuming muscle and fat to survive. They're lethargic, sleeping more than usual, showing less interest in play. Their ribs are visible. Their joints look oversized compared to their wasted muscles. Some children have developed the swollen bellies characteristic of protein deficiency, a cruel irony, where they look pregnant or full while they're actually starving. The elderly who are thin in January are skeletal in March. Some have already died, passing quietly in their sleep one cold night, their bodies simply unable to continue on the minimal calories available. Others are clearly dying, lying in bed, mostly conserving energy, eating almost nothing while family members hover, uncertain whether feeding them is kindness or cruelty at this point. Psychological effects are as serious as physical ones. You're irritable, snapping at family members over nothing, unable to control emotional reactions. Depression settles in heavy grey, making everything feel pointless. Some people become apathetic, stop trying, just lie in bed, waiting for death or spring, whichever comes first. Others become desperate, taking risks that would normally seem insane, stealing food poaching game despite harsh penalties, eating things that might be poisonous, because starvation is also poisonous. The community is fracturing under stress. Neighbours who shared freely in December are hoarding by March, unable or unwilling to help others when they're barely surviving themselves. Theft becomes more common, someone's breaking into storage areas, taking what little remains. Accusations fly, trust erodes, and the social bonds that normally sustain peasant communities are stretched to breaking. Wild foraging becomes absolutely crucial and increasingly desperate. You're looking for anything edible, grass seeds, tree buds that are just beginning to swell roots you'd normally ignore. Some people are eating grass itself, chewing it like cows trying to extract some nutrition, even though human digestive systems can't process cellulose effectively. It provides bulk, makes your stomach feel full temporarily, but offers minimal actual nutrition. Tree bark consumption increases. You've stripped inner bark from every accessible tree on your land and are starting to eye trees in the common areas or even on land you don't have clear rights to. The bark flour you're producing is barely edible, more fibre than food, but mixed with your remaining grain, it makes the grain stretch just a little further. Animal deaths are common. Chickens that stop laying and then die from cold or inadequate feed, pigs that you've kept alive through winter, but that finally succumb to the combined stress of cold and hunger. When an animal dies, you face the grim decision about whether the meat is still safe to eat. Most families err on the side of eating. It can't afford to waste protein, but sometimes this goes badly, and food poisoning adds to the general misery. Some families make the agonizing decision to slaughter breeding animals they'd planned to keep, the cow that's supposed to calve in spring, the pig that was meant to breed. These decisions represent giving up on the future to survive the present, and they have consequences that echo for years. Without breeding animals, you can't rebuild your livestock, which means next winter will be even harder. The weather in March is psychologically torture. Some days are warm, even beautiful, sun-shining birds singing hints of spring everywhere. You get excited thinking maybe the worst is over, maybe fresh food is just days away. Then winter returns with a late snowstorm or a hard freeze killing early plants, reminding you that spring is a process, not an event, and you're not safe yet. The actual first spring greens, when they finally appear, are miraculous. Wild garlic, pushing through leaf litter, its sharp smell announcing edibility. Nettles emerging their sting, a small price for the first fresh greens in months. Dandelion leaves bitter but nutritious, appearing in sunny spots. You harvest these obsessively carefully, trying not to over-harvest and destroy future growth, but also desperately hungry for fresh food. That first meal with spring greens, even just a handful of bitter nettle leaves added to your pottage, tastes like salvation. The bright, fresh flavour, the slight bitterness, the way your body seems to recognise that this is what it's been craving, that these nutrients are exactly what you've been missing. Some people cry eating the first spring greens, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude, and the simple fact that they survived to taste fresh food again. But March isn't over when the first greens appear. It's April before you have substantial amounts of fresh food, May before you're truly eating adequately again. March is just the month when hope becomes slightly more than delusion, when survival shifts from unlikely to possible, when you can finally believe tentatively, fearfully, that you might actually make it. When food runs out and bodies begin to fail, medieval peasants turn to a bewildering mixture of folk medicine, herbal remedies and semi-magical practices that blur the line between nutrition medicine and prayer. Because in a world without scientific understanding of vitamins, proteins or calories, people still recognize patterns, still know that certain substances help with certain symptoms of starvation, even if the explanations involve humours, spirits and divine intervention rather than biochemistry. Garlic occupies an almost supernatural position in medieval folk medicine, considered powerful against everything from weakness to evil spirits, and winter starvation is definitely the time when garlic's reputation gets tested. You've hopefully saved some garlic bulbs from autumn-dried stored carefully rationed through winter. When someone shows signs of serious weakness, when children stop responding normally, when the elderly seem to be slipping away, garlic enters the treatment protocol. The garlic gets crushed and mixed into whatever food exists or sometimes consumed directly, whole cloves chewed despite the burning intensity, or crushed into a paste and swallowed with water. The belief is that garlic provides strength, wards off illness, restores vitality. Modern science would say garlic has some antimicrobial properties and contains vitamins, but you're thinking in terms of hot and dry humours, counteracting the cold dampness of winter illness. Either way, people who eat garlic seem to do slightly better than those who don't, reinforcing the practice. Nettles are considered medicine as much as food, particularly for thin blood, what we'd recognise as anemia. Women especially are encouraged to eat nettles, the theory being that the plant's stinging quality translates into vitality and blood-building power. You collect nettles wearing gloves or wrapped hands, boil them thoroughly to remove the sting, and consume the resulting greens or drink the cooking liquid. The taste is mineral-rich, slightly metallic, and your body does seem to respond positively, probably because nettles actually are highly nutritious, loaded with iron and vitamins. Bone broth becomes medicinal in March, not just food. You've been boiling bones for months already, but now you're making special preparations. Bones simmered for days until they're soft enough to crumble, the marrow fully extracted, the resulting liquid thick and gelatinous when it cools. This broth is fed to the weakest family members, believed to provide strength and healing. It's rich in minerals and collagen, genuinely nutritious, though the medieval understanding is more about transferring the animal's vital essence to the human consumer. Honey, if any remains, becomes precious medicine rather than sweetener. A spoonful of honey for someone who's desperately weak, dissolved in warm water or ale, is believed to restore strength and fight illness. Honey is understood as having preservative and healing properties. Wounds treated with honey heal better, and consumption of honey helps internal ailments. Modern medicine confirms honey's antimicrobial properties, but you're operating on tradition and observation rather than laboratory analysis. Certain herbs are specifically for winter weakness and hunger sickness. Yarrow dried from summer collection gets brewed into tea for people showing signs of fever or infection, common when malnutrition compromises immune function. Chamomile provides comfort and helps with sleep, which is medicinal when stress and hunger create insomnia. Sage is believed to aid digestion and provide strength, getting added to any available food or consumed as tea. There's a folk practice of collecting the first spring water, the meltwater from snow, or the first rain of spring, and drinking it for purification and renewal. This water is considered specially potent, able to wash away the accumulated corruption and weakness of winter. Whether it actually helps or not, the ritual provides psychological benefit, marking the transition from winter to spring, from death to life. Some remedies blend into superstition and magic, placing rowan berries, if you collected any, under a sick person's bed to ward off malevolent spirits believed to prey on the weak. Saying specific prayers while preparing food, invoking saints known for protection and healing. Wearing small pouches of protective herbs, garlic again, but also vervain or St. John's wort around the neck to prevent illness. Bloodletting, practiced by barber surgeons and sometimes by knowledgeable villagers, seems counterintuitive when people are already weak, but the medical theory suggests that illness comes from imbalanced humours, and removing corrupted blood can restore balance. In reality, bloodletting a malnourished person is probably harmful, but the practice persists because sometimes people recover anyway, and the bloodletting gets credit. Fasting religiously required during Lent, but also sometimes prescribed medically, creates an interesting paradox. You're already essentially fasting due to lack of food, but intentional fasting is believed to have spiritual power that can heal both body and soul. The sick might be encouraged to fast completely for a day, taking only water, with prayers believing that this sacrifice will earn divine intervention. When someone recovers after such a fast, it's seen as miraculous, not as the natural result of finally resting their digestive system. Herbal purgatives, substances that induce vomiting or diarrhea, are sometimes used to cleanse the body of winter's accumulated corruption. This is particularly dangerous when someone is already malnourished and dehydrated, but the medical theory suggests that illness is trapped inside the body and must be expelled. Strong herbs like hellebore or certain types of mushrooms known for their purgative properties get used carefully in small doses by people who understand the risks but believe the benefits outweigh them. Eggs, when chickens finally start laying again with spring's arrival, are considered especially restorative. Raw eggs beaten with honey or ale are fed to the sick, believed to provide concentrated strength. Hard-boiled eggs are easier to digest for people whose stomachs have shrunk from months of minimal eating. The symbolism of eggs' new life potential spring adds psychological power to their nutritional value. Milk, particularly from the first milking after a cow calves in spring, is considered medicine. This first milk, or colostrum, is recognized as specially powerful, able to restore health to the sick and weak. It's thick yellowish, different from regular milk, and while medieval people don't understand immunoglobulins or antibodies, they know from observation that this milk is special and beneficial. Prayer and religious ritual accompany all these physical remedies. Masses said for the sick, candles lit before saints, known for healing pilgrimages promised. If recovery occurs, these spiritual practices run parallel to physical treatments, and people genuinely believe the spiritual component is at least as important as the physical. When someone recovers, it's attributed to God's mercy as much as to the garlic and bone broth, reinforcing religious devotion and creating a holistic understanding of healing. Some villages have someone known for healing knowledge, often an older woman, sometimes a man, occasionally someone with religious authority. These people maintain oral traditions of which herbs help, which ailments how to prepare remedies, when to try intervention, and when to accept that death is inevitable. Their knowledge is mixture of practical observation, inherited tradition, and personal intuition. Good healers are treasured community resources. poor ones can kill people through ignorance or bad luck. The psychological component of these remedies is significant even beyond any physical effects. Doing something, taking a remedy, performing a ritual, consulting a healer makes people feel less helpless, provides hope, activates placebo effects that can genuinely improve outcomes. The act of being cared for, having someone prepare special foods or medicines specifically for you, addresses the emotional and spiritual dimensions of suffering that are as real as the physical hunger. And when remedies fail, when someone dies despite all efforts, there's comfort in knowing everything possible was tried. The surviving family members don't carry guilt about inadequate care. They did the garlic, the bone broth, the prayers, the herbs. Death becomes God's will rather than personal failure, which helps with grief and allows life to continue. Survival through medieval winter isn't a solo achievement, it's a collective project where neighbours, extended family, and even distant community members pool resources, share labour, and create informal support networks that mean the difference between everyone scraping by and some people dying alone in the cold. The communal approach to winter survival is both practical necessity and profound social bonding, creating relationships and obligations that structure village life for generations. The most basic form of sharing is the communal cooking fire, particularly in the poorest households or in communities experiencing severe scarcity. Maintaining individual fires in each cottage burns through fuel at an unsustainable rate when wood or peat is scarce, so families coordinate one hearth serves multiple households with people taking turns hosting or contributing fuel. You bring your pot of pottage to your neighbour's fire, hang it alongside theirs, and both cook simultaneously, while children from both families huddle together absorbing warmth. This arrangement requires trust and negotiation. Whose house hosts the fire today? Who's contributing how much fuel? What happens when one family runs out of fuel entirely? Do they still get access to others' fires? These questions get worked out through a combination of tradition, fairness calculations, and recognition that nobody benefits if anyone freezes to death. The hosting rotates. The contributions adjust based on ability, and flexibility keeps everyone alive. Communal ovens, whether the Lord's oven that everyone must use for a fee, or a shared oven, built and maintained collectively, create natural gathering points and opportunities for coordination. You're already bringing your bread to be baked with everyone else's, so you see neighbours exchange information about who's struggling, who has surplus of something, who needs help. The oven becomes a communication hub as much as a cooking facility. Some villages organise formal food-sharing systems during extreme scarcity. When one household slaughters an animal, they distribute portions to multiple families with the understanding that when another household slaughters theirs, the favour will be returned. This prevents the feast or famine problem where one family has abundant fresh meat for a week and then nothing, while creating a system where everyone gets occasional meat throughout winter, rather than concentrated consumption followed by collective scarcity. Grain pooling happens in some communities, families contributing their remaining grain to a common store managed by trusted community members, who then distribute portions regularly to ensure everyone eats something, rather than some families running out completely while others still have reserves. This requires enormous trust-solid record-keeping, often done through notched sticks or other physical accounting methods, since most peasants can't write, and community consensus about fair distribution principles. Labour sharing becomes crucial as people weaken from hunger. Tasks that one family could easily handle in autumn, hauling water from the well, collecting firewood, caring for livestock, become overwhelming when everyone is malnourished. So communities organise a group of people goes woodcutching together, accomplishing in hours what would take individuals days, then distributing the wood according to need and contribution. Water gets hauled collectively with stronger individuals helping families that include only children and elderly. Child sharing might sound strange to modern ears, but it's a practical survival strategy. If one household is doing slightly better, has more food, warmer shelter, fewer mouths to feed, they might take in a child from a struggling neighbour family temporarily. This isn't adoption or permanent placement. It's understanding that the child will be better fed and cared for temporarily elsewhere, and when the crisis passes, they return home. It requires trust, generosity, and communal understanding that children's survival benefits everyone. Elderly and disabled community members often get shared care. A widow living alone can't maintain a fire cook for herself and survive winter independently, so neighbours check on her, bring portions of their own meals, ensure she has firewood, help with tasks she can't manage alone. This isn't formal charity, it's communal recognition that abandoned individuals die, and a community that lets people die alone is weaker and more frightened because everyone knows they could be next. Skills and knowledge get shared freely during crisis. Someone who's particularly good at making snares teaches others, multiplying the community's ability to catch rabbits. A person who knows which wild plants are edible leads foraging expeditions, ensuring everyone benefits from specialized knowledge. A skilled brewer helps families whose ale has gone wrong, preventing waste and maintaining everyone's access to safe drinking liquid. Knowledge hoarding. Keeping survival skills secret is considered antisocial and dangerous because everyone's survival is interconnected. Communal meals become more common as scarcity intensifies. Rather than each household cooking separately in their insufficient supplies, extended families or neighbour groups combine their resources. Everyone contributes what they have, creating one larger pot of pottage that everyone shares. You might contribute turnips while your neighbour adds grain, and another brings onions, resulting in a meal better than any individual household could produce alone. The social aspect matters too. Eating together, talking, sharing warmth and companionship alleviates the psychological isolation of winter hunger. Trading and bartering intensifies with people exchanging surpluses of one thing for deficits of another. You have extra ale because you brewed more than your family needs. Your neighbour has extra dried fish from autumn preparation. Trading creates mutual benefit without requiring money, which most peasants rarely have anyway. The informal economy of barter and exchange, governed by rough fairness and mutual need, functions as a survival distribution system. Religious communities, the local church and any monasteries serve as nodes in the sharing network, collecting resources from those who have extra and distributing to those in desperate need. Tithes and offerings that flow toward the church in good times flow back out as charity during crisis, creating a redistribution system that, when functioning properly, prevents the most extreme deprivation. Information sharing is itself a form of communal survival resource. Who's seen signs of early spring? Where are fish still catchable? Which woods have the best remaining foraging? Has anyone spotted game animals? This intelligence gets shared at the communal oven at church, at the well, anywhere people gather. Hoarding information that could help others survive is considered morally wrong, violating the communal ethics that govern crisis survival. Conflict resolution becomes essential because stress and hunger make people irritable and disputes multiply. Community elders or respected individuals mediate arguments about shared resources, about fairness in distribution, about real or perceived slights. Allowing conflicts to fester endangers everyone because feuding families won't cooperate in communal survival efforts. Maintaining social cohesion, even imperfectly, is a survival necessity. The obligations created during winter sharing persist after the crisis passes. If your neighbour fed your child through February when you couldn't, you owe them not necessarily material repayment, but loyalty support, reciprocal help when they face crisis. These obligations create dense networks of mutual interdependence that structure rural communities for generations long after the specific crisis that created them has been forgotten. Some villages have formal or informal insurance systems. Everyone contributes a small amount in good times to a common fund that gets distributed in bad times. When someone's house burns down or their harvest completely fails, the common fund provides emergency support. It's not enough to fully replace losses, but it prevents total collapse, keeping individuals connected to the community rather than sliding into permanent destitution. Not every community successfully organizes collective survival. Social tensions, inequality, personality conflicts, or simple lack of leadership can prevent effective cooperation. Villages that fail to organize communally show higher death rates during crisis winters, while those that successfully coordinate see more people survive. The difference between functional and dysfunctional communal support systems is literally measured in lives lost or preserved. The experience of communal survival shapes cultural values that persist for centuries. The emphasis on community over individualism, the automatic sharing impulses, the deep-seated understanding that personal survival depends on collective well-being. These aren't abstract values, but lived realities hammered into cultural consciousness through generations of winter survival. You learn in your bones that selfishness kills and generosity saves because you've watched both play out in real time during the hunger months. Rationing isn't a simple mathematical exercise, it's psychological warfare you wage against yourself daily, a constant negotiation between screaming hunger and iron discipline, and the mental exhaustion of deciding who eats how much becomes as draining as the physical hunger itself. You're not just managing food, you're managing hope, desperation, willpower, and the increasingly insistent voice in your head that says just eat it all now and deal with the consequences later. Every morning begins with the calculation. You look at what remains the grain sack that's lighter every day, the dwindling vegetables, the diminishing stores, and you do mental math that would challenge a modern accountant. How many days until you might reasonably expect spring greens? 30, 40, 50 if it's a late spring. How much food do you have? Enough for 30 days if you eat minimally. 20 days if everyone eats adequately. The math never adds up favourably, so you adjust downward again, shaving portions, extending the timeline, gambling on early spring. You portion food before serving it now, carefully measuring rather than allowing people to serve themselves, because hunger destroys self-control, and if you let people take what they want, the food disappears too fast. Each person gets their allotted amount measured by eye, by handfuls, by familiar cups or bowls used as standards. Children get their portion, adults get theirs. Everyone knows exactly how much they're receiving, and everyone knows it's not enough, but at least it's fair and it's all you have. The act of eating becomes strange when you're this hungry and this disciplined about rationing. You eat slowly, deliberately, trying to make the small amount of food last as long as possible, extracting maximum satisfaction from minimal calories. You chew thoroughly, paying attention to every texture and flavour, because this bowl of thin pottage might be all you eat for 12 hours. Some people close their eyes while eating, focusing entirely on the sensation, trying to trick their brain into feeling more satisfied. Between meals, the hunger is constant, and managing it requires mental techniques that border on meditation. You distract yourself with work. The busier you stay, the less you notice the emptiness in your stomach. You drink water or weak ale, frequently filling your stomach with liquid, even though you know it provides no calories. You chew on leather scraps or bits of wax just to have something in your mouth, to simulate the act of eating even when you're not. Nighttime is hardest because you're lying still unable to distract yourself, and hunger becomes the dominant sensation. You curl around the empty ache in your belly trying to sleep despite it, knowing that sleep is the only time you're not aware of being hungry. Some nights you can't sleep at all, kept awake by hunger pangs that feel like animals clawing inside you. Other nights you dream about food, elaborate detailed dreams of feasts and abundance that make waking up to reality genuinely cruel. The temptation to break discipline is constant and overwhelming. The remaining food is right there accessible, and a demon voice whispers that you could eat more now satisfy this immediate hunger. Feel full for the first time in weeks. The future, the abstract March or April when you'll run out if you're not careful, feels less real than the concrete present suffering. Resisting this temptation requires willpower that you must summon fresh every single day, sometimes multiple times per day. Children make rationing psychologically harder because they don't understand delayed gratification or survival mathematics. They're hungry now, they cry from hunger, they beg for more food and explaining that there isn't more, that they've had their portion, and there won't be another until tomorrow breaks your heart repeatedly. You're saying no to hungry children, your own children, and even though it's necessary for their long-term survival, it feels like cruelty and failure. You start bargaining with yourself. Maybe if you skip one meal, give your portion to the children, the food will last an extra day. But then you're weaker, less able to work, and if you collapse from weakness, who'll manage the household? Or maybe if you eat slightly more today, you're doing heavy work, you need strength, you can eat less tomorrow. But tomorrow you're also hungry, and you make the same rationalization, and suddenly the careful rationing plan has collapsed. Guilt becomes a constant companion. When you eat your portion, you feel guilty that you're consuming food that could go to someone else. When you give your portion away, you feel guilty about weakening yourself and reducing your ability to care for the family. When you enforce rationing on hungry children, you feel guilty about their suffering. There's no choice that doesn't generate guilt, no decision that feels morally comfortable. The psychological burden of being the person who controls food distribution is enormous. Usually this falls to the household head, typically a woman, since food management is traditionally feminine work and the responsibility is crushing. Every meal you're deciding who eats and how much, and people's lives depend on you getting these decisions right. If you ration too strictly and someone dies of weakness, that's your fault. If you ration too loosely and food runs out before spring, that's also your fault. There's a narrow optimal path, and finding it requires judgment under conditions of extreme stress and hunger. Some people develop obsessive behaviors around food, constantly checking the stores, counting and recounting what remains, calculating and recalculating the days until spring ratio. You might check the grain sack 3 times in an hour, as if looking at it more frequently will somehow make more grain appear. This compulsive checking provides an illusion of control in a situation where you're actually quite helpless. Food thoughts dominate consciousness in ways that people who've never been truly hungry struggle to understand. You think about food, constantly remember meals from better times, fantasize about future abundance, notice food references in prayers and songs in ways you never did before. Food becomes the lens through which you interpret everything. A bird flying overhead isn't just a bird, it's potential calories. A neighbour's slightly less gaunt appearance suggests they have food sources you don't, triggering envy and calculation. The physical sensations of hunger evolve over months. Initially, hunger is sharp, demanding, painful, your stomach cramping, your mouth watering at the thought of food. After months of inadequate nutrition, hunger becomes duller, more pervasive, less acute but more exhausting. It's not that you hurt less, it's that the pain has become baseline reality and you've stopped fully registering it as distinct sensation. You're always hungry, so hunger stops being an event and becomes a state of being. Decision fatigue sets in as the months progress. Every day requires dozens of food-related decisions: how much to eat now, how much to save, whether to use this ingredient or save it, whether someone needs extra or can manage with less, and making these decisions with a malnourished brain becomes increasingly difficult. You start making worse decisions either from cognitive impairment or from sheer exhaustion with the burden of choice. Some families develop elaborate rules to remove decision-making burden and reduce conflict. Everyone eats exactly equal portions, no exceptions. Or strict hierarchical rules: men eat first, then children, then women. Or age-based systems, youngest to oldest, ensuring the vulnerable are prioritized. These systems aren't always fair, but they're consistent, and consistency reduces the mental load of constantly negotiating who deserves what. There's a point, usually in late February or early March, when you realize you've made a miscalculation. The food won't last as long as you thought, or spring is later than you hoped, and the math no longer works. This moment of realization is psychologically devastating. All your discipline, all your careful rationing, all your sacrifice, and it's still not enough. You face a choice ration even more strictly, and watch everyone weaken further, or maintain current rationing, and run out before spring gambling on alternative food sources or charity or miracles. The psychological victory when you finally make it through when spring greens appear, and you didn't run out, or you ran out but managed to survive on foraging and charity until fresh food arrived, is profound but complicated. Relief? Yes, but also grief for what was lost, trauma from months of suffering and deep exhaustion. That's as much psychological as physical. You survived, but the cost was higher than you wanted to pay, and you'll have to do it again next winter. The first genuinely warm day in late March or early April feels like resurrection, not metaphorical but literal, like your body and soul are returning from a death you didn't quite notice you'd entered. You step outside and the air doesn't hurt. The sun has actual warmth instead of just light. The ground is soft, not frozen. And somewhere impossibly, unbelievably green things are pushing through dead leaves and mud, announcing that winter has finally, truly, definitively lost its grip on the world. Wild garlic is usually first because it's adapted to cold, designed to emerge early and claim sunlight before tree leaves block it. You find it by smell before you see it. That sharp, unmistakable garlic scent rising from patches in the woods, leading you to the green shoots like olfactory treasure maps. The leaves are tender, bright green, alive in a way that nothing has been alive for months. You pick carefully, taking only some from each patch, knowing these plants need to survive and spread, but also desperately hungry for fresh food. That first bite of wild garlic, raw, unwashed, still cold from the ground, is an experience that rewrites your understanding of food and flavor. It's sharp, almost painfully pungent green tasting, in a way you'd forgotten was possible, and it makes your whole body respond. Your mouth waters instantly. Your stomach, which has been resigned to bland mush for months, suddenly remembers what excitement feels like. Some people cry eating the first wild garlic. Others laugh. Most just eat silently, reverently grateful beyond words. Nettles appear shortly after their stinging leaves, paradoxically welcoming because they mean food. Real food, nutritious greens that your body has been craving without knowing specifically what it needed. You harvest wearing gloves or with cloth-wrapped hands, collecting the young tops before they grow too large and tough. The sting is nothing compared to the value of what you're gathering: plants that will stop the bleeding gums, the weakness, the strange skin problems that have developed over winter. You boil the nettles, watching them turn from bright to dark green as the heat destroys the sting and softens the leaves. The cooking water itself becomes valuable greenish liquid that tastes mineral-rich, slightly metallic, but fundamentally good. You drink this liquid straight, waste nothing, and your body seems to recognize it as medicine, as exactly what was missing. Within days of eating fresh greens, people start feeling better, more energy, better colour, improved mood, like someone flipped a biological switch from barely surviving to actually living. Dandelions emerge everywhere, their bitter leaves perfect salad material when picked young. You've spent 6 months viewing dandelions as weeds, plants that interfere with crops' nuisances to be removed, but now they're salvation edible abundance that requires no planting or cultivation. The bitter taste which you might have disliked in times of plenty now tastes sophisticated, complex, desirable. Your palate has adjusted and bitter greens taste like life itself. Young shoots of cultivated vegetables begin showing in gardens and fields, the leeks you planted last year sending up new growth onions sprouting fresh tops. Any root vegetables you left in the ground now producing edible leaves. These are often sweeter than wild greens, more familiar, reassuring in their domesticity. You harvest the greens carefully, trying not to damage the roots that you'll want to harvest later, balancing immediate food needs with future harvests. The amount of fresh food available in early spring is actually quite small, a handful of greens per day enough to supplement, but not replace your depleted stores, but the psychological impact is enormous. Fresh food means spring is real, means you survived, means the death cycle is broken and the life cycle is resumed. Every green shoot is proof that you made it through, that your rationing worked, that next year's food cycle is beginning. Your body responds to fresh greens in ways that feel almost magical, but are actually just biochemistry. Vitamin C from the greens addresses the scurvy symptoms you didn't quite recognize. Your bleeding gums start healing. The strange bruises begin fading. Your energy improves dramatically. Vitamin K helps with blood clotting issues. Folate and other B vitamins support cellular function that's been compromised. Fiber helps digestive systems that have been functioning on minimal bulk. You're not thinking in terms of vitamins, you just know that greens make people better, and that knowledge has been tested and confirmed through countless generations. The first spring rain feels cleansing, washing away winter's accumulated grime and bringing everything truly alive. Plants respond to the rain with visible growth. You can almost watch things getting greener, fuller, more abundant. Mushrooms appear after rains, and you forage the edible varieties, carefully adding them to your increasingly varied diet. The combination of greens, mushrooms, and your remaining winter stores creates meals that are still simple, but no longer desperate. Birds return, filling the air with sound after months of relative silence. Migratory species that fled south for winter come back, and their presence is its own food source. Eggs can be gathered from nests, though you do this carefully, taking only some and leaving others so the bird population survive. Birdsong itself is psychologically nourishing soundtrack to renewal, proof that the frozen silence of winter has ended. Lambing and calving happen in springtime, so young animals arrive when food becomes available. New animals mean renewed milk production. The cows and goats that barely produced anything through winter suddenly have milk again, abundant and rich. The first fresh milk in months is a celebration cream rising to the top, butter churned with renewed efficiency, cheese made from surplus that actually exists again. The fields need ploughing and planting, work that's exhausting after months of minimal food, but you're motivated by necessity and hope. Every seed planted is investment in not repeating this winter's suffering. You're thin, weak, still recovering, but you work anyway, because the alternative is facing another winter with inadequate stores, and that possibility is more terrifying than current exhaustion. Fishing improves dramatically as water warms and fish become active. They're emerging from winter torpor just as you are moving to shallower waters, feeding actively easier to catch. Fresh fish, actually fresh, not preserved, taste like luxury after months of salted, smoked, or no fish at all. You eat some immediately and preserve some for future use, already thinking ahead to next winter, because that's how survival works. Social interactions resume with more energy and positivity. People emerge from their cottages more frequently, visit neighbours, share news about who survived and who didn't. There's grief for those lost winter always claims some people, the old, the sick, the unlucky, but also gratitude and renewed connection among survivors. You've been through collective trauma and emerged together, creating bonds that will last until the next crisis tests them again. The first truly warm evening when you can sit outside after sunset without immediately freezing feels like a different world. You watch the sunset, feel warm air on your skin, listen to evening sounds, and the contrast with January's brutal cold and February's desperate hunger makes this moment almost unbearably sweet. You're alive. You survived. Spring came just like the old people promised it would, just like you hoped it would, despite doubts. Your body begins recovering slowly, gradually, but visibly. You gain weight, muscles rebuild, energy returns. Children start playing again with real enthusiasm rather than listless pretense. The elderly who survived, and not all did, show signs of revival, colour returning to faces, strength slowly rebuilding. It'll be weeks or months before anyone is truly healthy, before the winter's damage fully heals, but the trajectory is upward now instead of downward. Looking back at winter from the safety of spring creates complex emotions. Pride that you survived, grief for what was lost, trauma from suffering that was genuinely extreme, and gratitude that it's over. You'll face winter again. It comes every year, inevitable as death and nearly as frightening. But for now, spring is here, food exists, warmth has returned, and that's enough. You survived, and that simple fact contains more complexity than any modern person can fully grasp. Survival wasn't heroic or dramatic. It was a grinding daily accumulation of small choices, careful calculations, and collective effort that stretched across 4 brutal months. Looking back from the warmth of May when fresh vegetables are growing and danger is past, you can finally process what winter actually demanded from you. And the lessons carved into your bones will shape not just next winter's preparation, but your entire worldview for the rest of your life. The first lesson seared deepest, because it was tested most severely, is that community matters more than individual strength. The families that tried to survive alone hoarding resources and refusing to share often fared worse than those embedded in networks of mutual support. You learned that your neighbour's survival is your survival, that helping others creates obligations and connections that will eventually help you, that isolation is a luxury nobody can afford when scarcity threatens everyone. This isn't abstract philosophy, it's demonstrated fact proven by who lived and who died. Storage and preservation knowledge became literally life or death skills, and you now understand why older people obsess over proper food storage, why your grandmother spent hours checking root cellars, why arguments about preservation techniques can become heated. Every detail matters: salt ratios, smoking duration, storage temperatures, timing of harvest. Because errors mean food spoiled, and food spoiled could mean death. You'll pass this knowledge to your children with new urgency, understanding that what might seem like old person fussiness is actually accumulated survival wisdom. Rationing discipline proved essential but psychologically devastating, teaching you that humans can endure far more hunger than seems possible, but at significant mental cost. You discovered reserves of willpower you didn't know you possessed, but you also discovered that exercising that willpower daily for months is exhausting in ways that don't fully heal. Some part of you will always be a little broken around food, slightly obsessive about stores, uncomfortable with waste, unable to fully relax into abundance, because winter taught you that plenty is temporary and hunger is always waiting. The inequality between noble and peasant tables, visible all year but stark in winter, creates lasting political awareness that makes peasant revolts comprehensible, even if not inevitable. You can't forget that you were eating turnip peel while the Lord ate venison, that your children cried from hunger while his dogs ate meat, that the system is designed to ensure some people feast while others barely survive. Whether this awareness translates into action or just simmering resentment depends on many factors, but the knowledge is now a permanent part of your worldview. Marginal improvements matter enormously. An extra sack of grain, a few more dried vegetables slightly better, preservation technique, one additional egg-laying chicken. These small differences that seem trivial in abundance are massive in scarcity. You learn to never dismiss small preparations or minor efficiencies, understanding that survival often comes down to accumulation of modest advantages rather than dramatic interventions. Next autumn, you'll gather one more basket of hazelnuts dry, one more string of mushrooms, store one more wheel of cheese. Because you know these margins can be literal life margins. Children's resilience surprised you. They suffered absolutely, but they bounced back faster than the adults once food became available. Conversely, the elderly were more fragile than you'd realized, with winter claiming grandparents and aged relatives in ways that left permanent holes in family structure. You learned that age matters in survival odds, that protecting the young and accepting losses among the old is grim necessity, and that these calculations, however uncomfortable, are part of reality rather than moral failures. Wild food knowledge proved more valuable than you'd appreciated before experiencing genuine scarcity. Every edible wild plant, every foraging skill, every hunting and fishing technique, every bit of wilderness wisdom became crucial supplementation when stored food ran low. You'll pay more attention to wild foods, now teach your children to identify edible plants, maintain relationships with people who have specialized foraging knowledge, because you understand that domesticated food alone isn't always sufficient. Faith and ritual provided psychological structure when physical circumstances were overwhelming, giving you frameworks for understanding suffering reasons to persist, and communal practices that reinforced social bonds. Whether the religious explanations are literally true matters less than their functional utility, prayer got you through desperate nights. Feast days broke endless monotony. Religious charity provided safety nets, and spiritual meaning made suffering bearable. You'll maintain religious practice not just from belief but from recognition of its survival utility. Planning for the worst-case scenario rather than optimistic average case became obviously correct strategy. The families that prepared as if winter would be long and brutal even if it turned out milder were fine. Those who gambled on mild winter and average stores suffered or died when winter was harsh. You'll embrace pessimistic planning going forward, storing more than seems necessary, preparing for catastrophe, accepting that over-preparation's cost is far lower than under-preparations. The limits of self-reliance became clear. No individual or nuclear family can survive winter completely independently in medieval conditions. You need community, you need specialized skills from various people, you need trading networks and support systems and collective institutions. Romantic notions of independent self-sufficiency aren't just wrong, they're dangerous delusions that get people killed. Interdependence isn't weakness, it's survival strategy. Food is never just food, it's security, it's power, it's health, it's comfort, it's social connection, it's meaning. The meals you'll eat from now on carry weight. They didn't before winter, because you know what it's like to not have them. Abundance will never feel quite abundant enough. Scarcity will always trigger deeper anxiety than it would have previously, and your relationship with eating is permanently altered by having experienced genuine sustained hunger. Your body's fragility and resilience both surprised you. Fragility. How quickly strength drains with inadequate food, how many systems begin failing under malnutrition, how small the margin is between functioning and collapsing. Resilience. How much abuse the human body can endure and still recover, how rapidly fresh food restores function, how capable you are of surviving conditions that seemed unsurvivable while experiencing them. You'll never take health for granted again, understanding it as temporary blessing rather than default state. The value of knowledge over material possessions became obvious. You can lose food stores to spoilage, theft, fire, or miscalculation, but you can't lose the knowledge of how to preserve food, forage wild edibles, ration, effectively organize communal support. Knowledge passes to children, spreads through community, accumulates across generations, making it the most valuable inheritance you can leave. You'll prioritize teaching over material accumulation differently now. Winter will come again. This isn't speculation but certainty, and you're already thinking about next year's preparation with intensity that people who've never faced starvation can't fully appreciate. The cycle continues. Spring planting, summer, growing autumn, harvest, winter survival, repeat indefinitely until you die, or the world changes fundamentally. This isn't tragic, it's just reality, the rhythm of agricultural life, the pattern your ancestors lived, and your descendants will live. But for now, in this present moment of late spring warmth and growing abundance, you can rest. The immediate crisis has passed. Food exists. Life continues. You survived winter, and that simple accomplishment, surviving, is worthy of quiet pride and deep gratitude. Tomorrow brings new challenges, next winter brings new threats. But tonight you can eat fresh vegetables, feel warm air, sleep without desperate hunger, and know that you endured what needed enduring. The fire doesn't need to burn quite so hot tonight. The food stores are replenishing rather than depleting. The calculations can relax slightly. Winter taught you its harsh lessons, carved its wisdom into your bones, and then finally mercifully released you back into the living world. You survived. That matters. That's enough. The seasons turn slowly, but they always turn. Spring becomes summer, becomes autumn, becomes winter again, the wheel rolling forward, carrying you with it. You've learned what you needed to learn. You'll remember what you must remember, and when winter returns as it will, as it must, you'll be ready. Not comfortable, not eager, but ready. The medieval peasant's winter survival wasn't about heroism or adventure. It was about endurance, community, knowledge, and the stubborn refusal to surrender even when surrender seemed easier. It was about eating tree bark and being grateful, about rationing spoonfuls of pottage and calling it enough, about watching the stores diminish and believing sometimes against all evidence that spring would arrive before they ran out completely. Most winters that belief proved justified. Some winters it didn't, and people died, and the survivors buried them and continued because the alternative was giving up, and giving up meant joining them in the ground. The harshness wasn't cruelty, it was just reality. The conditions under which human life existed for most of history, the baseline that makes modern abundance seem almost fictional by comparison. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your warm bed, with your full stomach, spare a thought. For those medieval peasants surviving winter on turnips and prayer, they weren't so different from you, same fears, same hopes, Same determination to protect their loved ones and see another spring. They just had fewer resources, harsher conditions, and no certainty that effort would be rewarded with survival. They endured anyway, and most of them, not all, but most made it through to see the wild garlic bloom again, to taste fresh greens again, to feel warm sun again. That persistence, that refusal to quit even when quitting, seemed rational, that daily choice to continue despite everything. That's the real story of how medieval peasants survived winter without starving to death. The chamber grows quiet, the fire settles to embers. The story ends here, but the seasons continue their eternal rotation. Winter comes, winter passes, life persists. See you in the next video. Good night. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.